Hey, leave the door open. There's a bit of a smell here.
Yeah, that's what remains of the Third Reich. Yes. There's a part of it.
Go on digging! And underneath the remains, as you call it, of the Third Reich, you will find the gold which will help to found its successor. You find that funny, Colonel Engels, do you? Well, so do I. It is very funny that the enemies of the Third Reich should be so helpful in founding the Fourth. Make no mistake, my British friends. There will be another Reich, only this time it will spread all over the world, and then people like...
È scoppiato un incendio, rifugio in fiamme!
Sta qui! Sta qui, what's that?
E andiamo, presto, presto!
This is Bristol. It's Friday. It's, 6:15. Well, sorry about that little delay. And welcome to Not the BCFM Politics Show on Friday the 29th of March 2024, streaming live from the People's Republic of Stokes Croft in Bristol on the talkradio.org.uk stream at radioquk.com in Camberley, Surrey. I have to ping him later and let him know, sorry, we're a little bit late tonight. And also live on the Not the BCFM Politics Show app, available free from all good app stores. Please use Aurora. Don't use Google Play. You can actually go and disable it, would you believe, in your phone once you've installed Aurora from Google Play. And you can then get all of the actually original apps via the Aurora store. I bet Google, just really trying to get around their little monopoly. Well, I'm Tony Gosling. Thank you for turning off the psycho in the corner, gaslighting us with its military psyops, the puff pieces on the conspirators, and the hatchet jobs on the heroes. So helping us navigate the World Economic Forum's Fourth Industrial Revolution, or the Fourth Reich Matrix. God knows what it is we're dealing with these days. It's Irish Republican Labour activist Martin Summers, and I'm also joined by Dr. Chris Hook here in the studio. A little bit later on we've got, I suppose it's a treat. Yes, it is a treat, from Katharine Gun. We've had a lot of talk this week about China trying to hack into our parliamentary election computers. She has got some fascinating things to say about all that. Katharine Gun, the GCHQ whistleblower from the Iraq War, now living out in Turkey, and also a bit of a special with Kees van der Pijl. He's a lecturer in international relations that was at Sussex University. He had to leave Sussex University because of some sort of dispute about Israel. Surprise, surprise. But anyway, he is one of the speakers in Amsterdam on Sunday to the big peace rally they're having there. And he's also the author of a book called States of Emergency, Keeping the Global Population in Check, which I'm in the middle of reading at the moment. It's wonderful. So it's lovely to have an interview with Kees van der Pijl talking about the power of nightmares. That's how politics has turned from visions of a future into just various frightening things that they're going to try and save us from. And also he talks a bit about this idea of false flag attacks. So we also hope to be joined by Warren Thornton a little bit later to talk about the Moscow terror attack, which was taking place just pretty much as we were broadcasting this time last Friday. But Dr. Chris Hook, who's with us, Chris, could you just say a little bit about your how you got into use emergency medicine? I think you do, isn't it?
Yeah.
How did you get to do that?
So it's just one of the medical specialties here in the UK. So at some point earlier in my career, decided I quite liked working in emergency situations, and started training in that, and I've ended up at the Bristol Royal Infirmary just down the road here.
Isn't it a bit stressful, being in an emergency room, especially with the whole political climate with the NHS at the right now?
Yeah, I mean, it's always really busy, and with that obviously comes a lot of stress, and you have to find ways to get through that and deal with that. It's all part of the training, part of the learning, to sort of try and get through to manage the sort of busyness and the difficulties in the department and stuff. Yeah.
Now, you've been working over in Gaza. Is that with MSF or who?
Yeah, with Medecin Sans Frontieres.
Yeah. But before we talk about that, can you say something about the whole situation with the junior doctors who have been on strike again this week? These are obviously people that you're working with quite a lot. As I understand it, there is a real problem with actually retaining staff, because many of them can see that there's far better wages that they're getting abroad, and they just don't. There's a kind of morale has collapsed. But obviously, how much you're paid has got a lot to do with that. So, what's your take on that?
Yeah, I mean, I'm actually a junior doctor doctor myself, so I've taken part in some of the strikes over the time. And I guess, like the NHS, it is really busy. It is really stressful to work in. There's a lot of pressures that come as being a junior doctor. You're expected to move around quite a lot as part of your training. You're expected to work in departments and things that you wouldn't necessarily want to work in. And I think there's just a general feeling that the system itself is sort of under such great pressure, and maybe in a way that's not really being appreciated at the top levels of government properly. People are stressed, they're tired, and like you say, the rewards of suffering those stresses and difficulties are getting less and less each day. And I think particularly when you first start out as a doctor, you graduate from medical school now with more and more debt to try and get through that education, and people are going to be burdened with that for the rest of their lives, the rest of their careers, and the pay doesn't reflect the stress and the responsibility that comes with the job, and I think that is starting to be felt really keenly, particularly at the younger levels where you start. When you first start out with these big debt repayments and salary that is being squeezed from all sides. And I think the biggest morale sort of deflator is this lack of willingness to sort of come to the table, really, and truly negotiate and offer all sides a fair deal. And it's not just the junior doctors; the nurses are under the same stresses and same pressures, if not greater. They're being badly treated in terms of pay negotiations. Paramedics the same, and everyone really in the whole NHS. I think it needs a whole big turnaround pretty quick to keep people.
Just give you the health secretary's job. I'm not even sure who it is these days. They seem to change so often. It's a sort of toxic brand that they think, oh no, we can't actually get away with having this person having that title anymore. What would you do? Is it just about pay, or is it more to it than that?
I think there's a lot about it. There's pay is the issue that is easiest to sort of identify and say, look, you're not keeping pay up with the cost of living, so standards of living for NHS staff are going down for all NHS staff, and that I think is the easiest thing to identify. But then there's the way the system runs needs to adapt and change as well, and there just needs to be more general input into the system to keep up with expectations of modern healthcare. And what people are experiencing, and the sort of changes in the profile of disease and things throughout the country, and what we're facing, particularly since COVID. It's been, that seems to have exacerbated everything, and the system is sort of on the point of collapse in many ways.
Yeah, I think you're right, particularly with these great big long waiting lists. Yeah. But anyway, what about Gaza? When did you first see that there was this war had started, and when did you first get out there? Was there any choice in the matter? Did you get a call saying, are you up for it?
Yeah, so I worked in Gaza twice before this war, so I have out there people I genuinely consider friends from my time out there in previous jobs. So when this war kicked off, I think it became quite quickly clear that it was different to previous wars. And I'd been in Gaza before for various sort of escalations of various types, and been there when Gaza was closed off and you couldn't get in and out, and I'd been there when rockets were launched and when rockets were landing. But this definitely felt different from day one, when we heard how aggressive the tactics had been. And I worked with several organisations there, so they always stay in touch and say, are you available for various things? And for the last few years I haven't, but when I got a call, I was on holiday in France, and one of my best friend out there, a woman I'd worked with for many months while I was out there, sent me a voice note saying that she'd just had to evacuate her house and was in the street with her 3 kids who I know. And it was at that point I think it really hit home that this was something that I felt really passionately about, that I had to do something. And I guess I'm fortunate enough in that I have organisations who then are in contact saying, would you go? Are you available? And I had the ability to go and say, look, okay, yeah, I can take some time. And my job here at the Bristol Royal Infirmary, they were really understanding and allowed me some time off. So I think it was the end of basically the first week. of the war. I volunteered to go, but we had no access. So I was in Egypt for 5 weeks from that point, before finally getting access to Gaza. So yeah, it's a place where a piece of me lives, and I've got great friends there, and it was a really personal thing that I had to go and do. But like I say, really fortunate, I think, that I have the contacts and the organisations that were available for me to be able to go and work.
Well, look, tell us about the frustrations, because you as a professional trying to do your job, it must have been very difficult without supplies of various things. And also, of course, you've got a massive throughput from a hospital that can't really cope with that, as well as all the pressures that there are on the staff. So just take us through that.
Yeah, I mean, so if you think, we were just talking about how under pressure our health system is here, and if you multiply that somewhere by 10, it's what Gaza was under already anyway, in terms of lack of resource and difficulties before this war started. So then when you arrive and the supplies that you need aren't getting in, communications are almost impossible because the phone lines are down most of the time. There's almost no internet, so it's really hard to stay in contact with people. And every time you start some level of support somewhere, the front line moves every few days or every week, and the new area comes into the attack zone that's listed in blocks and things. And so, we arrived, we opened some clinics, and within 3 or 4 days, those clinics fell into a zone that was now under an evacuation order because it's going to be attacked. Some of our staff went to work in one hospital in the middle area, and then the road gets cut between the middle and the south. And so this just constantly happened. So we'd set up a project, and then a few days later we had to close it and move because it was no longer safe. We put stuff in a warehouse, and then suddenly it was under an evacuation order in that area where the warehouse is. So you've got to make a plan to try and somehow safely go and retrieve the stores and supplies that you do have. So it's just every day a new problem. And you think all these organisations, MSF, and all the big organisations out there, rely on Palestinian staff. That's who's doing all the work, really. People like me go to take the blame for stuff. We go to help organise. We go because we bring a different skill set or set of standards, but the work is really being done by Palestinian staff. And all those staff have been displaced from their house. Not only displaced, they've then found news that their house has been destroyed, or their business has been destroyed, or their family have been killed, or their family are injured, and now they're living in a tent with this bad injury. So it was borderline impossible at times to get some level of support up and running. And we see that now that, the amount of support getting in is just strangled at the border. And what they used to have 400, 500 trucks a day or whatever it was that used to go in, and now they're down to, maximum 100 or 200 if they're really lucky. And you think healthcare relies on water, relies on nutrition. These are both really, really struggling now, and they were already struggling when I was there back in December. So, almost impossible on a day-to-day basis to set something up with any vision for the future, because you know that it's gonna come under attack. And even when that attack seems to have passed, and you think we can go back, you look at places like Shifa Hospital, Nasser Hospital, where, we've been talking about going back to these places because they've been cleared and now things are settling down a bit, and then the war comes back to them again. And so at the moment, I think it's just, there's no way to plan anything more than a few days or a week or so in advance, because of that unstable nature of it all.
So what about surely there is also this kind of, you're there professionally trying to do your job, but in the background there must be a certain amount of anger at the politics of it all and the military side of it, because this is a pretty horrific, this is the sort of thing I think many of us thought that we weren't going to see again, this sort of mass slaughter of civilians.
Yeah, I guess, so in my time in Gaza, I would say, I worked across the whole of the Gaza Strip in many of the different hospitals, and I met a lot of people, and all anybody there really wants is what we often take for granted here in the UK, which is some freedoms, the ability to look after your family, the ability to have a decent job, to have somewhere nice to live that's fairly safe, that has some water and you can get the food and stuff you need. Nobody's looking for much. And I think the great sadness of it all is that those are the people who are suffering the most. The military leaders, the leaders of all the political organisations aren't there. they're in other parts of the world. They're not the ones suffering. It's the day-to-day people. It's the local people whose families are being killed, whose homes are being destroyed, whose livelihoods are being taken away from them, and whose hope for the future is being removed. And it's not the kids of the political leaders who are going to grow up disturbed by the fact that bombs have moved them from their house like 10 times and they've seen their mates killed. It's the people. The local population, it's the people like you and I from Gaza who are suffering, and I think that's what generates the sort of the anger about it all. It's not the leaders. Nobody's attacking the leaders of anything. It's people who've been brainwashed into believing something that are fighting between the two sides, and it's the day-to-day population that are suffering as a result of it all.
Do you see any end in sight? Were you obviously watching what's going on around the world? We've had actually this week an announcement, which we're going to hear in a minute, from the United Nations that this most definitely is a genocide, even though the ICJ, the court in The Hague, hasn't quite said that yet. Certainly the United Nations are now saying that. Do you think there's any chance that this may come to an end at some point soon?
I mean, it has to, doesn't it? Everything eventually comes to an end. I hope that the end comes tomorrow or today, and I hope it comes as, while there's still something for the population to rebuild and to carry on living with. But I don't think we can ever give up hope that this will end, because that's when the people who on both sides who have escalated this, that's when they win, is when the hope dies, I think. And when I left Gaza, I thought it would be over, certainly by now. But I think it's an absolute tragedy that the two sides can't get together and just find some sort of agreement that stops all this for the population there.
Martin Summers, can you just give us your thoughts about is this something where Netanyahu, in a way, is caught in a trap that he's got to keep the war going, otherwise he's going to go to jail?
Well, there's obviously his personal. He's got his personal agenda, and in Israel itself, of course, people are far more critical of the way he's managed things than they are in the liberal media here. Like Haaretz, for example, which is the Israeli version of The Guardian, has often been very critical. I mean, they're the ones who've raised questions about what happened on October the 7th. Where were the army? Because they've obviously removed them from near to the fence and so on. I think ultimately the rest of the world sees this as a political conflict that's got to be resolved by political means. And the Western powers, by taking the line that they've got to smash Hamas, you can't do that. The Tamil Tigers in Sri Lanka were very, very seriously bloody-minded terrorists. They were ultimately crushed by the Sri Lankan army, when killing thousands and thousands of civilians in the process. And then the central government in Colombo decided that they would allow local elections in the Tamil areas just to sort of try and stabilise the situation. And surprise, surprise, the Tamil Tiger candidates won every seat, because that's the way it works. And you can't just wish. I don't like the right wing in Israel at all, but they're representative of the people they represent, and you can't exclude them from negotiation.
No,
because you can't.
Chris, the Israelis claim that Hamas is very much embedded in some of these hospitals. They've actually, it's the first time I've really seen hospitals themselves being deliberately targeted. In fact, some of the staff, as soon as it looks like they're being targeted in these hospitals, just try to get out as soon as they can, because they may be being taken hostage, kidnapped by the Israelis, or prisoner, or that sort of thing. What do you make of that?
I mean, like I say, so I worked in Gaza a lot before. I've worked in all of the main government hospitals. I've never seen anything at all, ever, that made me believe there was a significant military presence or ability to operate from those sites. When I was in Gaza, and people have asked me this many times, never saw anything in the main hospitals that I visited, in Nasser Hospital, European Gaza Hospital, that suggested any way that there could be a significant military attack launched from there. Thousands of people just living on the floor, and there's no way you could launch a rocket from there, like, without injuring people. I've been in places in the world where, I've worked in Yemen, and rockets regularly launched from near the hospital, and it's loud, it destroys things nearby, it blows windows out and stuff. Never seen anything like that in Gaza, ever. So the fact that the idea that the hospitals are somehow the base, I don't think we've seen evidence of that. I've never seen it personally up close, and I've not seen anything shown to us through the media, through any source.
Or by whatever means, the Israelis are saying Hamas are in there, around it, or in there, and Hamas is the object of their ire. That's who they're trying to kill.
Yeah. I guess by definition, Hamas are everywhere in the population. People are amongst the people generally. It's impossible in Gaza to be separate from things because it's so small, it's so compact, and now the population are crushed into a tiny, even smaller space. So of course, if Hamas are there, or what we're fighting against in terms of Hamas, which is the sort of armed cells and stuff like that, some of those people are going to be amongst the population somewhere. Injured people are going to go to hospital, so they're going to be taken as injured soldiers. Doesn't mean that you're not protected by international law because you're a soldier who's now injured and taken from the battlefield and put in a hospital. That doesn't allow you to attack hospitals, unfortunately. And I think what we've seen is actually the doctors and nurses and all the medical staff that work in those hospitals have been some of the bravest people I've ever seen, where they stayed until the bitter end. Patients are still coming, and so they stay. And they stay, and they stay, and they know the hospitals are being surrounded, and they still stay. They know the hospitals are now under attack, and they still stay. And then they're arrested when they try to leave. When it's too dangerous, and the army come through and are in the buildings, and they say, get out, get out, get out. And then these people are arrested. And that's what I find the most difficult thing about it. These spaces need to be protected. They are for use for injured people, ill people, and the people providing the care. You can't just target them, and that seems to be a new thing that's happened. I've not seen it in this way anywhere else before.
Well, let's have a listen now to the United Nations Special Rapporteur on human rights in Palestine. Must be a pretty awkward job right now. Francesca Albanese speaking this week.
After 5 months of monitoring and analysing Israel's onslaught on Gaza, my report finds that there are reasonable grounds to believe that the threshold indicating that Israel is committing the crime of genocide against the Palestinians as a group in Gaza has been met. Specifically, Israel has committed 3 acts of genocide with a requisite intent: killing members of the group, causing serious bodily or mental harm to members of the group, and deliberately inflicting on the group conditions of life calculated to bring about its physical destruction in whole or in part. The flagrant and systematic slaughter of Palestinian civilians, the deployment of unlawful weaponry, the utter obliteration of vital civilian infrastructure, including the deliberate targeting of all Gaza's hospitals, and the man-made starvation of the Palestinian people transcend the realm of war crimes and crimes against humanity that had been seen in the occupied Palestinian territory before. The monstrosity unfolding is accompanied by a pervasive anti-Palestinian narrative and dehumanization emanating from the uppermost tiers of Israeli society, including high-ranking officials with command authority and frequently reflected in soldiers' actions on the ground. This reflects the intent, a dolus specialis, to destroy in whole or in part, which is what distinguishes genocide from other atrocity crimes. In the case of Gaza, there exists a chilling clarity of this purpose: the systematic eradication of an entire people, or at least a significant part thereof. One of the key findings is that Israel's executive and military leadership and soldiers have intentionally distorted, using bellow principles, subverted their protection functions in an attempt to legitimize genocidal violence against the Palestinian people. The only reasonable inference that can be drawn from the unveiling of this policy is an Israeli state policy of genocidal violence toward the Palestinian people in Gaza. As you say, are there documents? If you read my report, you will see that I've quoted official documents, legal analysis, that the legal justification that Israel uses. There are two, one version and then an updated version with the key legal findings. And it's exactly what I said. It's humanitarian camouflage, because they justify what they're doing using IHL categories. evacuations and human shields. Everyone is a human shield. Everyone is a human shield. Women, children, anything that is between the troops and whatever is their objective. And by the way, the overall objective, eradicating Hamas, destroying Hamas, which is not even a real military objective. Because one thing is to neutralize, destroy the military capacity of an organization. Another thing is to target also the civilian components. And this is what has been done. Every Hamas affiliate has been considered targetable, killable, and so their family members. This explains the 30,000 people who have been killed. Plus, I mean, this is a conservative figure I'm referring to.
So that's Francesca Albanese, Special Rapporteur on human rights in Palestine, actually, not just Gaza. Martin, this is going on. It's going on. No one's really stopping the Israelis, are they? And surely that's what needs to happen.
Yes, well, obviously they need to stop, but whether they will is another matter. Obviously, that's speculation. We can't presume anything, really.
But it's almost as if the Israelis are taking the mickey here. They're saying, well, no one dares to touch us, so we're just going to carry on.
Yes, well, I mean, they obviously there's splits opening up between the government in Israel and representing popular opinion in Israel, which it does, and, for example, the United States. So even Trump has come out and said, well, you can't just go around killing civilians like that. You're giving yourself a bad name. Now, that is unheard of, really, in the past, because Trump was very, very pro-Israeli when he was president. And I think that they're now, the Western establishment are now, they're trying to find a way to square the circle of trying to pretend to be neutral, but they can't pretend to be neutral anymore. It's too late. And of course, the big geopolitical changes, of course, is having the Russian aerospace forces in Syria. And if they could, and it's a goal of the Syrian government and the Russians support them in this to retake the Golan Heights, which has been annexed by the Israelis, but it doesn't belong to them. They took it through force. And it's still the policy of the government in Damascus to retake it, and it's also Russian policy. And at some point, as World War III hots up, a country the size of Wales is going to find itself in a very strategic, weak position. I mean, they used to be militarily overpower their opponents.
Yeah, there's been
it's not necessarily going to be the case going forward.
About inaction from the Arab countries that traditionally have been supporting the Palestinians, Chris. Is there a sense of obviously there is, to a certain extent, a sense of despair where people are simply trying to get away from Palestine? I mean, surely even you at times, when you're over there, must have thought, look, I've just got to get out of this place, because not only are these war crimes going on, but I don't want to put words in your mouth, you might not call them war crimes, I imagine you probably would, but nothing's being done about it. It's almost as if the entire legal system of planet Earth has broken down.
Yeah, and I think that's the greatest sort of sadness of it all, isn't it, is that, even it's taken, what are we now, 4 or 5 months of it for us to finally agree that just stopping killing civilians is a good thing in the international community, and I think certainly huge swathes of the population of Gaza would sort of happily leave at the moment. They've got no reason to stay in Gaza. Their homes have been destroyed, their lives have been taken from them. So I think the fact that the leaders of the world have taken this long to get to any sort of sense of being able to come together and talk about sensibly that this needs to stop, and it needs to stop now, I think is an absolute disgrace. And we've been calling for this since week one, for a very vulnerable population. And I think it's an absolute disgrace it's got this far. Okay,
so what about this whole idea of the Palestinians? Because they're obviously they love their land. This is their land. This is the land where their parents are buried, probably hundreds of thousands even of years back. Aren't they also getting to the stage where they're thinking we just got to get out of here, or I mean, what was the sense?
I think there's a lot of people that, there's a lot of people who've chosen to leave already. I think the hope is that they'll always be able to come back, but anybody trapped in that sort of it's like shooting fish in a barrel, isn't it? They're trapped in there. They can't get out. So anybody that's there at the moment, it's sort of a vaguely sensible idea to say, if I could get out and survive, then I will.
But the choice has been made for them by the Egyptians and the Israelis, stopping people leaving. We were hearing a couple of weeks ago actually about This guy, Organi, apparently, he runs the Rafah crossing, some sort of privatised, outsourced thing from the Egyptian government, and he's we were hearing he's charging people $3,000 to just across the border.
I think it's now much more closer to 10 or 12 these days. Yeah. Right. So the price has basically been going up since day one.
Do you have to pay to get in and out as well?
Well, we paid a sort of a nominal visa fee to get in and a border crossing fee to get out. But for the Gazan population, if you've got £10,000, $10,000, you can walk up to the border and pay to leave. But obviously 99.999% of the population don't have that money, and to get your entire family out is then hundreds of thousands of dollars, and even to find that cash, even if you had it in the bank, to find that amount of cash to pay someone is almost impossible. But that's people are choosing that route out. They're the fortunate few who've got the money, and it's the problem with war, isn't it? Always disproportionately affects the poorest, and the wealthiest are able to get away and make a new life, and we see that everywhere. But I think there are a lot of Gazans who, if you said right now, you can leave, a lot of them would. The hope always being for them that they would be able to go back. But remember, this is a population now who, the stories always came from their grandparents about the loss of their land and the loss of their homes, and now they're experiencing it the same for themselves. And I met a lot of people who said, when I was in Gaza City when it all started, I said, I'll stay here. I'd rather die in Gaza City than live as a refugee in the south. I'd rather die here. And then they say, actually, when the bombs hit your neighbours and you feel the building shake and you see your neighbours die, no, that changes because you've got kids. And actually you say, no, actually, I don't want to die here in Gaza, so I'm going to go. And they've gone south and south and south. And that same sentiment will stick with them, that, as much as people say and feel deep down that you'd rather stay where you are and die than leave your land, when the truth is, when reality hits that you are going to die and your family are going to die, or you might see your kids die, no, you choose to go, you choose to try and move, you choose to try and leave, and they're trapped. I totally believe a lot of the population would leave if they could, and with the desperation to come back. But
I'd just like to point out that an obvious thing that the Israeli army could have done at the beginning of this crisis was to say to the civilian population of Gaza, you get behind us. Yeah, get behind us. We will put you in camp cities in Israel, on the top of the villages that you used to live in, and then we will separate you from the Hamas military who are inside Gaza. And they could have done that, but they didn't want to do it because then they'd have to accept that the Palestinians in Gaza had the right to return to the villages from which they'd been originally expelled.
We had a Jewish lecturer from the London School of Economics, Philippa Winkler, in here explaining that actually there is no right to self-defence for the Israelis in occupied land. So it's almost as if it's the law of the jungle, Chris, now. The legal system around the world is just useless.
Yeah. I mean, you can debate till the cows come home whether we use the words war crimes, genocide, whether international humanitarian law has been breached, whether this is war, is it international conflict, is it whatever it is it occupation, whatever, and people's views will twist depending on which side of the coin you're trying to argue and stuff. But at the end of the day, we're now 33,000 people, mostly women and children, have been killed in less than 6 months, and nobody can argue with that. Nobody can say that is in any way a good thing, whatever your politics, whichever side you're on, unless you are an absolute extremist, nobody can say that that's a good thing.
Well, what Francesca Albanese is saying from the UN is actually that is the political objective, to wipe those people out, civilians or otherwise.
I'm sure that there's obviously political objectives from what Israel say is that they want to eradicate Hamas, and we were talking a bit before that, it's almost impossible to eradicate an organisation like this. You've seen it in Afghanistan, 20 years of lack of Taliban control, and they come back immediately.
They tried it with the IRA. I seem to remember that it actually was a massive recruiting sergeant for the IRA in Ireland. Anyway, the sorts of injuries you're dealing with over in Gaza must be a complete, another dimension to the stuff from the BRI, is it? Yeah.
I mean, the injuries that you see over there, or that we were seeing, they are these huge, devastating, life-changing injuries. If you survive being crushed by a 3 or 4 story building, you're not necessarily the lucky one. They have life-changing injuries, huge burns, 60, 70, 80% burns across the body, needing massive skin grafts, broken limbs, needing amputations. The population, if you've been lucky enough to survive up to now, there are a huge part of the population who are either going to be permanently disabled or unable to function as they were. And there's going to be many more people who go on to die as a result of their injuries in the next few months to the next few years because of those disabilities, because of the risk of infection, of the inability to look after yourself going forwards. And it's stuff I've never seen quite like this before, like in such great numbers. And you'd be in an emergency department and just 10, 15, 20 of the most devastatingly injured people I've ever seen in my career, all arriving all at once, brought by their neighbours in trucks, brought by the few ambulances that are still functioning. And it was a daily occurrence, 2, 3, 4 times a day. No health system in the world could cope with what they've had to endure, let alone one that was under the pressures they were under before, let alone with the lack of access to other resources being allowed in, and now on the brink of starvation, exhaustion, dehydration. It's the whole cumulative effect of it is going to be felt for decades.
How does the society keep going under the circumstances like that?
It's an incredible group of people, isn't it? Like I say, I go back to some of the healthcare workers who, if we saw and dealt with some of the stuff they were dealing with on a daily basis. I went to Gaza with we took a surgeon, an anaesthetist, or a couple of anaesthetists, an intensive care doctor, and after 2 or 3 weeks, most of us were brutalised to the point of, when you leave, it's taken months and months and months to get over this. Those people are trapped. They're still there. They're going through the same thing day in, day out. The population are going to be, their mental health is going to be scarred for years, but they're an incredible group of people who keep coming back, keep, turning up to work, keep fighting. You think, I worked for MSF, and now all of our staff that are working have lost their homes in the north. They've then been displaced from the middle area. They're being forced to live in tents in Rafah, and yet they still come to work because they believe in supporting their people. They believe in helping, and that's their form of resistance. That is what they do, is keep saying, look, I'm still here. I'm going to still keep going. Whatever you do to me, you can keep doing. I'm going to keep trying. I'm going to keep fighting to live. I'm going to keep fighting to have a life and for my children, etc., etc. And it's an incredible thing to witness and be a part of, that sort of ability to keep going in these circumstances. I'm not sure that I would be able to.
What about from here, from all this distance? You've obviously done quite a lot to support the people there. What can people do? What do you think? There are particular charities, things like that are worth supporting. It's nice to see, actually. It took a while, but even TV ads for Gaza, for I think it's UNICEF or one of these UN charities. But what did you see on the ground was actually being helpful in Gaza right now?
There's lots of great charities from the UK doing great stuff. Medical Aid for Palestinians is working there. UK Med have set up a field hospital. Obviously, I worked for Medecin Sans Frontieres. They doing all sorts of amazing stuff there. The UN is functioning in a way that I've never seen it in any other way. Without the UN at the moment, Gaza would have fallen in a heap already. The way they are working, whatever you think about that, the organisation as a whole, is them that's holding it all together and keeping the Palestinian population of Gaza alive. So if you can support any of those organisations, fantastic. Keep calling for a ceasefire. The protests and stuff, people talk about, it's not on the news anymore and stuff. You've got to keep fighting for it to be in the news. You've got to keep talking about it, telling the world about it. That's why I come on shows like this and try to tell the world about it constantly, because you've just got to keep pushing. Keep talking to your MP. There's elections coming up. Make it an election issue. We've got local government elections coming up. Let's keep talking about it. Put the politicians under pressure to take a stance, to keep putting pressure on Israel to stop, and just don't let it go. Like, we shouldn't be in a situation where we're saying that the only thing we can do is keep putting more aid in. No, the people of Gaza need the ability to rebuild their lives, for commerce to restart, for farming to restart, for trade to be allowed back in. You should never be saying that the only thing that can happen is that we need to allow aid to keep a population alive. That's the bare minimum that should be happening at the moment. But keep supporting these organisations and keep fighting for it to be an issue. Can you make sense of why Britain and America seem to be so behind the Israelis still? I mean, I guess that's a historical thing, isn't it? We've always backed them, and it's pretty hard to step away from that. And I think what I find the most disappointing thing about it is that, we don't seem to have a view of our own, and we're not following the view of the population as a whole. I think, the majority of the British population support a ceasefire and have done since early in the war. And our government has not reflected that. And we follow America, we follow America, we follow America. And only when America say, oh, we're allowed to do this, do we sort of change tack a little bit. Or only when the pressure gets so great do a few politicians start to say, oh, okay, let's change tack. And I think that's just really sad, is that it's not reflective of the British people as a whole. No, certainly isn't. One thing that is happening, we had a meeting downstairs here actually earlier this week. It's something about the creation. It's called Bristol Transformed. It's a left-wing socialist sort of group. And what they're doing is they're setting up something called an apartheid-free zone here in Bristol. So the idea is to identify Israeli goods around the city, and to there's also, I won't go into the actual tactics of the group, but this is something which you can actually look on a lot of items and see, oh, that's from Israel, and do something about it. And what they're doing is they're drawing on the experience back in the 1980s of the St Paul's apartheid-free zone, referring to South Africa, because they cleared all the South African goods out of St Paul's and other parts of the cities, forced Barclays Bank, who were invested in South Africa, to close down. Is that worthwhile, do you think? I mean, I guess everybody's going to make their own choices about where they stand with all of this. Like, there's a lot of illegal settlements and things in Israel from which a lot of goods come, and I think we need to look at where you're buying things from and saying, like, where the companies operate and what do they truly support. I do always want to say that I think the majority of the general population of Israel do not support what is happening. They don't support the murder of women and children. And the Israeli people I know tell me that. And obviously it's difficult for them. They've got hostages still held in Gaza, and it causes a lot of conflict in emotion and stuff like that. But yeah, look at where you're buying things from. If you feel it's supporting the destruction of Gaza, or if you feel it's supporting illegal settlements in Israel, maybe that's something that you take part in. It's a choice that's out there. And there are. I mean, I was amazed to find Reverend John Anglo down in Yatton. He runs a charity which is supporting a school in Gaza. Has been for decades, called the Lighthouse School in Gaza City. So anyway, well, look, Chris, it's been a real pleasure hearing what you've got to say. Of course, this is very dark and difficult stuff. But at the end of the day, I think you're right. You do have to keep hoping, even if it means you're going to lose your life, as many of these Palestinians are going to do, just by carrying on trying to help and heal people. Their spirit isn't broken, is it? No. I don't think you will ever break the spirit of them. I think that's one of the great things about the people of Gaza that I've always met, is that, like I say, their spirit, their togetherness, their desire for a better life for themselves and their kids will never be destroyed, and I think that's a wonderful trait. Well, Dr. Chris Hook, thanks ever so much for joining us. We're now going to hear from the Reverend John Anglo about the whole situation with his school, which obviously is not functioning anymore, but actually the charity most definitely is, because it's still supporting people actually in Gaza City right now.
The school is still there. It's right next door to Ashley Hospital, which is run by the Diocese of Jerusalem, by the Anglican Church. It's just a wall between the two, actually. And the school was hit with artillery fire, and a hole was put in the wall on two sides of a classroom. Most of the windows have been blown in. and therefore that, of course, has caused damage inside, but that's a question of tidying up as opposed to repairs. Windows will need to be repaired. There's shrapnel damage on the walls, and the solar panels on the roof, which have been very helpful for electricity for the school, those have been damaged. But the school is standing. The playground had cars parked in them. Some of the Christians in a church next door had parked their cars in the grounds of the playground, and when the school was hit with artillery fire, those cars were torched and burnt out. So the school is standing. I've talked to the principal of the school, who has been into the school, and the school is repairable. Let's put it that way.
Okay.
As far as the building is concerned.
So when did you last visit? What situation was it when you managed to get there last?
The last time I visited was in May last year, and my wife and I had planned to visit again in the middle of October last year. But of course, the war happened on October the 7th. We were due to fly 11 days later, which of course we had to cancel. I have been out to Israel. I was out in Israel last month. I spent 8 days out there in the West Bank with friends. Obviously, I couldn't get into Gaza. Nobody's allowed in except some people with humanitarian aid, although Israel isn't allowing those in at the moment. But I did talk, obviously, on the phone to some of my friends in Gaza. I mean, I could talk to them from England if I want to. When Wi-Fi is usable, when there's electricity available, which it often isn't because Israeli attacks have blown out those facilities.
Are there no lessons to be taking place during the war at all then?
Absolutely none. Absolutely none. And that's the case in all the schools. There are 2 or 3 other Christian schools connected with the Orthodox Church and the Roman Catholic Church in Gaza, in addition to this school, Al-Manar, which is an independent Christian school. And you see, in all the United Nations schools, if you like, you could say the state schools in Gaza that are run by the United Nations and the Palestinian Authority, they are full of people. Every classroom has a family, at least one family living in it. So there is no education going on. The universities have been destroyed. The buildings have been destroyed. And, apart from that destruction, people are very hesitant to even move out of where they are sheltering. I mean, my friends are sheltering in the Roman Catholic Church, about 400 of them, 400 people there, about 400 people in the Greek Orthodox Church, in the compound, as it were, of those 2 churches. That is the sum total of the Christians that are in Gaza, about 800 or 900. I know of 3 teachers that managed very early, 3 Muslim teachers, to get out of Gaza through Rafah, and 2 have gone to Jordan. 2 have gone to Egypt, and 1 has gone to Jordan. We have been able, as a school management, to continue to pay the teachers by paying into their bank accounts, and from their bank accounts they can use their plastic cards, obviously, to pay for goods. They can't get cash out of the banks because many of the banks have been destroyed, or at least they're closed, or the bank vaults, as it were, haven't got any more money because it's all been emptied out. But they are able to pay for things by Visa cards through their bank, the banking system. That is still operative.
So that's from Yatton in Somerset, the Reverend John Anglo, talking about his Lighthouse School, the Hope Christian Trust Church's charity. The amazing, Martin, really, isn't it, that even that so much support is desperately needed, but they can get a little bit of money through to these people. No education going on whatsoever, but now the Christians are sheltering in the churches, which are next to the school. The situation is, it does sort of show that these people, he's been going backwards and forwards to Gaza for decades. I don't think he ever thought he'd see this kind of situation take place, where his own school has come under attack, and as well as the nearby churches, and people are sheltering, desperate for their lives.
Well, we all know, do we not, the extremity of the situation. And of course, there is a substantial Christian population of Palestinians, many of them Greek Orthodox, and they are, Hamas, although it's a Muslim organisation, recognises that other faiths are to be respected in free Palestine, and there's never been really any argument about that.
Now, if you're interested in that, there's a longer version of that interview up on our show page at thisweek.org.uk later, as well as the one with Francesca Albanese from the United Nations. But we're going to stay with this Christian theme, because Pastor Dia Moodley, who we heard from a few weeks ago, having the police climb down, saying he's not allowed to say this and that. For example, he's not allowed to talk about differences between one faith and another. The police sent him a letter just before he took them to court to say, actually, no, we're not going to do that. We're not... you can speak about these things, and we were a little bit over the top with our... Anyway, so he kind of won against the police. Last week, last Thursday, in fact, he was arrested. One of the most... he was up at the university on his plinth. But anyway, let him take us through the story. We won't talk too much about that, because he's now being charged. My guess is that the police will drop those charges, but we shall see. So here he is talking about his negotiations with the police, and also something about what exactly he was talking about that so upset apparently some of the female students, particularly up at Bristol University.
My name is Dia Moodley. I'm the pastor of a church called Spirit of Life Reformed Baptist Church in an area called Lockleys in Bristol, United Kingdom. So the matter we settled out of court was an offer that was made from Avon and Somerset Constabulary to admit that their action against me was disproportionate. What I mean by that is that 2 years ago they issued me what's the first stage of legal action, which is called a warning notice. And in the warning notice, it was a number of points were listed, I think about 10 points. A number of them had to do with amplification and other things. But the important things for us that was worrying was they wanted me to get their permission if I had to speak. I couldn't speak for over an hour in Bristol, in the public. I had to speak with their permission. And I couldn't speak I was not allowed to speak to an evolutionist or an atheist. Wasn't allowed to compare Christianity to any other religion in Bristol. So we took them to court. I didn't sign that. I didn't accept that. And the warning notice was effective only for 6 months. In other words, it had expired anyway. But I didn't want to let it go, because I felt it was a breach of freedom of speech, freedom of religion, freedom of religious expression. And I found myself not just fighting for the case of a Christian's freedom here, but for everybody's freedom. I do believe if an atheist wants to challenge a Christian, he must do so publicly, and we must hear his views. Same with a Muslim or an agnostic or a humanist or a secularist. Whether you are with God or without God, you must be able to exercise your view freely. And I welcome that. And so I would also wanted them to welcome the fact also that we Christians can speak freely. But the police didn't think so. So they went and put this, they went to their legal department and decided to put this document together, which was an illegal document, which I refused to sign. And I took them to court. And 1 week before we could go to court in November 2023, they came back to me with a settlement offer, which is they did not apologize, which would have been good. They used the word disproportionate, which I settled for. Their action against me in the warning notice, saying that I could not speak to an evolutionist or an atheist and things like that, they admitted on their part was disproportionate. I decided to settle that with them, to accept that. And so we settled out of court. They are now stuck with the legal bill for the whole case, which I do think that every taxpayer should know about, because we warned the police not to go down this route, yet they still went down the route. We told them they were wrong and that they insisted they were right. And now it's costing the taxpayer close to 70 to 80,000 pounds, which Avon and Somerset will pay for all the legal fees, mine and theirs. But listen, they're not paying it from their pocket. They're taking it from the taxpayer's purse. And so
that's right. But wasn't there also a matter there of discussing other religions too?
Yes, indeed. One point on the warning notice was not to compare Christianity with any other religion.
Why would you wish to do that?
Well, we do what's called comparative religious studies. The preaching of the gospel involves identifying what we would say that which is false and that which is true. And so all through the Bible, you find God inspiring his people to, for example, make the distinction between an idol and the true and living God. So he says, for example, idols have eyes but cannot see, ears but cannot hear, mouth but cannot speak. And then God compares himself to the idol and say, but I have eyes that I can see, and I've got ears and I can hear. So there's this comparison between that which is fake and that which is real. And the Bible tells us there's exclusively one way to God. It is through the Christian God of the Bible, the Judeo-Christian God, which is Jehovah, Yahweh. And Jesus comes to say, I am the way, the truth, and the life. So that means that when Jesus says, I am the way, the truth, and the life, he's making an exclusive statement, and that he's the only way, the only truth, and the only life. The grammatical construct of that scripture uses what we call the definite article. And it says, I am the only way, the only truth, and the only life, meaning that all other gods are non-existent, that they're not the way. And so we were being challenged by Muslims who were saying that, how can we say that? And atheists who do not even believe in God would say to us, well, how can you say that Jesus is the only way? And therefore this idea of we cannot compare our religion to any other religion in the public square came about.
Yeah, it's fascinating because actually surely every faith, including atheism, if you can call it a faith, or faith in science, all these individual ideas, they believe that they are the best way, but they surely don't have the right or ability in law to say that anybody that says a different thing is breaking the law.
Tony, this is what we're dealing with at the moment. I mean, I found myself against a massive war machine. It was the constabulary, it was certain religious groups, it was certain lobbying groups that had come together, the Church of England itself throwing its hat into the ring and joining with the constabulary to create a 19-page dossier against me and my church, saying how wrong we are to have our particular version of the Bible and preach what we are preaching.
Hang on. You mean the Anglican Church actually weighing in on the side of saying you're not allowed to say that Christ is the way, the truth, and the life? That
Yes.
sounds bizarre.
Yes, they went to the Church of England, and the Church of England put a 3-page document into this 19-page. Now, the name of the person for the Church of England has been redacted, but the following line after the full stop says she said. So it's a female who's written this, either a female Anglican minister or the Bishop of Bristol, who we know is female, has written this and said that Dia Moodley and his congregation have a gross misunderstanding of the Bible, and that the sin, hell, and judgment they preach about is really non-existent, and went on to talk about how they go about things.
This is a tradition that actually was begun by people like John Wesley many years. In fact, Wesley's chapel is actually down there in Broadmead, isn't it?
Yeah, Wesley and Whitfield. So we have two major people of historical reference for Bristol and Gloucester. So Wesley being obviously one of them. You're right. The Wesley Chapel, which I have stood outside personally for many years now, preaching, and George Whitfield himself from Gloucester coming to Bristol many times. Whitfield and Wesley were very close friends, though they differed theologically on some things, but they were joining together and preaching on the streets. So these very cobblestone streets now we've taken to, we're not standing on a wooden crate that they would have stood on, but nevertheless a ladder that we stand on to gain some sort of ability to be able to speak over the crowd so people can hear us. And so we've been doing that for the last 7 years. I'm raising up a team of men in my church, and when we go about preaching, they often ask me, why do we have to speak on these things? And I said to them, listen, if we were living in the times of slavery in Bristol, in the sense of the ships arriving in our city, and if we were living in those times and we were Christians, and we saw the slaves walked off the ship, and we looked at that, and we would have said something about it, because from a biblical Christian worldview, you recognize that all mankind is created in the image of God. And therefore, you'd look at that like John Newton did, who wrote Amazing Grace. He was a son of a slave trader, and he saw that trading in human life was a sin, and therefore he repented and became a Christian. So we would have spoken against it in that time. So in a similar way, as Christians, we see the things now, abortion being one of them. Over 800 babies a day, actually 850 is the latest figure, 850 babies a day in the United Kingdom, which we would say, murdered in the name of my body, my choice. And so what do we do about that? With abortion is, in our worldview, in our language, we say that abortion has killed more human lives than all the wars put together. So from October 1967 to this day, where abortion has been legalized in the country, more human lives have been taken through abortion than all the wars. And I get asked all the time, it's a legally right, it's a law that says that abortions are allowed. And I often say, yes, at one time slavery was lawful in the United Kingdom. But if it's lawful, it doesn't make it morally right. And that's where the abolitionists came in. And they said, it's not morally right to do this, although it's lawful. So let's change the law. So we're standing against the tide now and saying, although it's lawfully right, is it morally right? So we're asking the question and making a truth statement from the Bible that says, thou shalt not kill.
Well, that's Pastor Dia Moodley speaking to me earlier this week after having been arrested. Well, we'll be following that one and seeing if the police drop the charges. And, I would like to have talked to him a bit more about that arrest, but since he's now been charged, that is actually, it becomes potentially contempt of court. But all I can say about it is there were several events, one of which he was actually pushed off of he has got a kind of mini ladder thing he stands on. And then afterwards, the police were called and arrested him, even though it does look as if potentially he had been assaulted. Anyway, I'm joined in the studio now by Warren Thornton. Hi, Warren. Welcome to the People's Republic of Stokes-Croft.
Hello, and thank you very much for having me.
Do you want to tell us a little bit about your how you got into doing your Western Supermare broadcasts and podcasts?
Yeah, we work for a company called the Frontline.Army, which is on Rumble, and the reason I got into it, many, many years ago, I was a sniper in the British Army, and then I was an aid worker for about 7 or 8 years, in which we went to war-torn countries, and of course we got to know many, shall we say, military attachés who always go as special envoys to countries, but they're actually there to look after their own interests. We got to meet embassy staff, obviously military personnel, and we got to meet aid workers, and of course we've kept those contacts up. And very, very simply, how I started was they were all phoning me up and saying, Warren, we can't speak about this. If we do, we'll get fired, or maybe even worse. Can you do it? So I started a little TikTok channel. Suddenly there were 75,000 people on there, and it sort of went from there.
Yeah, well, you were also involved in this business of the Nazi guy speaking over in the Canadian Parliament, which is where we first come across you. Now, you actually did get arrested there. Has there been any consequences? Are you suing the police for wrongful arrest or anything?
The whole idea is we can keep going, but of course it would cost a heck of a lot of money because you'd have to take out. You can't get. It would have to be a civil matter, which seems absolutely crazy, doesn't it? But
no, you're suing them for compensation, aren't you? You're saying actually what you've done there is wrongful arrest, which I think I'm pretty sure that's civil. Anyway,
yes.
They're not going to arrest the police don't arrest each other for arresting someone wrongfully, as far as I know.
No, they don't. And the strangest thing about it was when we broke the story about the Nazi in the Canadian Parliament, and we had it that Trudeau knew, that Freeland knew, that Gould knew, who is obviously the Speaker of the House or the person who sorts out the seating. And of course, we knew absolutely correctly that Rota knew because he received funds from the Nazi son in the Canadian Parliament.
God. Now, you got, was it misinformation, disinformation and malinformation? Would you like to explain those to us, please?
Certainly. So, misinformation is when you don't know that something is untrue and you broadcast it. Obviously, that's disinformation. Misinformation. Disinformation is when you know it to be untrue and you still broadcast it. But malinformation is when you know it to be true, but putting it in the public sphere may be harmful. And of course, we explained it very, very simply that under the journalistic charter, as far as we're concerned, anybody lying is, whether that be public or private, to the public, under the journalistic charter, you have a right to inform the people that that's happening.
Well, you certainly should do. Malinformation sounds to me like the sort of thing that Mariana Spring at the BBC Verify service just dreams about, because that's the sort of stuff she seems to go for. We had Judith Brown on a couple of weeks ago talking about the whole fact-check system. So these are facts which are true, but someone up in high authority, much higher up pay grade than you or I, has decided should not be allowed, the public shouldn't be allowed to know. Now, this really does set a massive challenge up against journalism generally, doesn't it? Because what we do is we're trying to get to the bottom of things. So it's as if you're trying to get to the bottom of something for the public's use. Suddenly you're told, well, actually, no, you can't do that journalism anymore.
Yeah, absolutely. And the problem that you have as well, and we've interviewed Judith Brown, is that there is over 8,000 people that are employed by these fact checkers. Most of these fact checkers are funded, and they have every single language covered in the world, even the most archaic. These fact checkers, 3/4 of them are run by companies that are to do with the Friends of Israel.
Well, I think we should be hunting the malinformation. I mean, the thing is, of course, this is all just propaganda, really. The idea is that there is an attempt to use the mass media to bamboozle the public, and the thing is, the public are realising that, and freelance journalists like you and I were on making sure that the good information is there, and they're trying to put a lid on it.
Yeah, absolutely, and they do that by arrests. I mean, one only has to look at Assange. What did he really do? What he actually did was told everybody what people were up to. Now, it is a journalist who is supposed to do that. A journalist is meant to hold governments to account, but the trouble is the government and journalism now in mainstream media walks in lockstep together, and that is always a bad thing. There's a wonderful old thing that says, I don't know whether you've ever seen the film Network, but Peter Finch is there, and he says, when the 12th largest company in the world owns the biggest media propaganda machine in the world, we're all in a lot of trouble.
I think he said, I'm mad as hell.
Yes, that's
just can't take it anymore. And he gets all of the listeners at the same time, the viewers, to go out onto their balcony and start screaming it. And it's a great, really fun film, that Network. In fact, there's quite a lot of those old films from the 70s and 80s, particularly, that resonate with a lot of what's going on in the world today, aren't there? So, you mentioned Julian Assange. That's where we're heading next. And this week, there was a judgment that the whole thing is going to be, well, seems to me, I mean, get your take before we hear from Stella Assange. Be interesting to get your take, because I looked at this thinking, well, the last thing they want is for this to go to the European Court of Human Rights. It's quite feasible that at the European Court of Human Rights, the European Union will stick two fingers up in Britain and say, we're going to let Julian go. So they've delayed all that. So what do you make of the whole legal process as it is at the moment?
Well, the whole legal process is absolutely normally quite terrible, and it needs to go to the European Court of Human Rights so that people can get this. You've only got to look at, for instance, and I'll use this, it seems quite crazy, but we are using the political system in our justice system. You've only got to look at the Trump award, which he had to pay so much money and this, that and the other. That's purely political. You've only got to look at Andrew Bridgen having to pay £40,000 to take, having to pay Hancock's legal expenses. So what we're using is we're politicising the justice system, which is not what it's about. And we politicise the justice system in the case of Julian Assange. And Stella Assange is quite right when she turns around and says that everything that's happened to Julian Assange is an absolute travesty.
Apparently, it's about £3 million. If you donate about £3 million to the Conservative Party, you can get yourself an honour. We've had another Mohammed Mansour today. Rishi Sunak is facing criticism, the BBC tell us, after a Tory donor was given a knighthood. We also, of course, have had the favourable contracts given to Stephen Hester for the National Health Service, and he gave a £15 million donation, as we saw a few weeks ago. So the whole system, the whole sort of political system seems to be being broken, Warren. Actually, the idea is, it's just about money, actually, and the principles are out the window.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, there are only two parliamentarians out there, as far as I'm concerned, that are even worth electing, George Galloway and Andrew Bridgen, because they will go against the mainstream. When you look at the Gaza situation, for instance, Rishi Sunak and Keir Starmer, you look at both of them, neither of them have spoken out against what is now the UN have actually called and is officially a genocide.
Yeah, well, we had that a minute ago. But look, Stella Assange has had a lot to say. One of the things I would also point out is we have to start asking ourselves, what is wrong with the justice system? Who is it that's appointing these judges? Well, the answer is it was the Queen. It's now King Charles actually makes those appointments. They are recommended by people either in the Justice Department or the Prime Minister. But the final decision, whether it's army officers, whether it's police chief constables, whether it's ambassadors, or in this case the judges. This is a royal prerogative. So everything is many roads seem to be leading towards King Charles at the moment.
Yeah, absolutely, and there's no question whatsoever that he has, he's bought into many of the things that the World Economic Forum go on about, the climate change, I mean, you name it. And the trouble is, most of these leaders that we have, if you look at the young global leaders around the world, you look at Rishi Sunak, you look at Trudeau, you look at Macron, every single one of them young global leaders, and look at Millet, who's just come out and denounced the president, obviously the president of Colombia, because he dared to actually speak against Israel. And it is these factions inside, and obviously the royal family with everything that's gone on at the moment, there are many, many questions still to answer there, aren't there?
Well, I would just say one word. Diana.
Yeah.
The word I would say. But anyway, so let's have a listen now to Stella Assange, who earlier this week explained why she thinks that this is such an appalling process that Julian's going through. I think we all know that. Yep. But she puts it into, I think, she's a brilliant speaker. She's quite slow in what she says, but what she says is devastating.
There's no prospect for a fair trial in the United States. The reasons are manifold. First of all, Julian has been charged under the Espionage Act. This is the first time a publisher has been charged under this act, which is from 1917, during the First World War. The purpose of this act was never meant for publishers. It was never meant in the context of journalistic activity. He is accused of receiving information from Chelsea Manning, possessing it and publishing it to the public. And that information was of the highest public interest, involving evidence of state-sponsored criminality. So that means that the United States has charged him under a statute that does not allow a public interest defense. He is not allowed to say, well, I published because it evidenced crimes. He is exposed to 175 years imprisonment. There's no public interest defense under the Espionage Act. And this is also the country that has plotted to assassinate Julian. So naturally, there is no prospect for either a fair trial or Julian being safe in that country.
Julian,
it's a mistake to treat this case as a legal case. It is a political case. It is a political persecution that is pursued through lawfare by using the law to imprison a man for political reasons. And so any suggestion that the U.S. judicial system will be able to treat Julian fairly is an impossibility. Well, the British legal system and political system has been a accessory in the persecution of Julian. Anyone who looks at this case and at his treatment objectively understand that administrative excuses are being used to treat Julian in a cruel and unusual manner that no other person has been exposed to. The simple fact that Julian has been in the harshest prison in the UK without charge, without serving a sentence, and in relation to an extradition which is political in every respect, from the charges against him, which are political offences, the Espionage Act, to the content of his publications, which exposed wrongdoing by states or state actors in the context of war. Well, Julian is deteriorated physically. His mental health is under a constant strain, and it changes from day to day. Some days are extremely difficult, some days he cannot sleep. So it's impossible to generalize. It is a constant struggle, and because he is indefinitely in a high security prison so far for 5 years. This is the first time that a publisher has been openly accused for journalism. Julian is not a whistleblower. The whistleblower was Chelsea Manning. She was the source, and she gave Julian information that was of public interest, and Julian published it alongside other journalists and newspapers. And so it is a departure from the principle of press freedom. It is a departure which creates a precedent in which the press is fair game. The press can be pursued criminally for publishing the truth. It's a game changer, and there's no coming back from this unless the US drops the charges against Julian. Whatever happens in Julian's case, unless there is a pardon or dropping the charges, it is catastrophic for the press.
Would you agree with that, Warren? That's Stella Assange there, Julian Assange's wife, explaining that the manoeuvrings that have been around getting him charged under the Espionage Act, although he clearly isn't a whistleblower, he's a journalist, he's a publisher, that the ramifications will be enormous on the press if he does go down?
Oh, yeah, absolutely. I mean, Julian Assange is, if you like, the godfather of what you might call the free press in the modern world. Many years ago, it was a couple of other people, but this guy does not belong in jail. All he's done is tell you the truth. He's told you what the governments have been up to. This nonsense about secrets, that, you know, everybody says, oh, it's the Official Secrets Act, and this, that, and the other. That's just a ruse to stop you knowing what people are up to. What Julian Assange has done has brought to light many, many things that have gone on and shouldn't be going on around the world. And he is, if you like, this guy is the guy that every journalist should look up to.
In a way, it's similar to what we were just chatting with Dr. Chris Hook just now about Gaza, in that it does seem as if the rule of law has broken down, or is breaking down, or has had it, and actually now the law of the jungle.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, you've only got to look
Might is right. Yeah, that
yeah,
sort of thing.
Absolutely. I mean, you've only got to look at Miller, the American spokesperson, who's just come out about the UN. And now Gaza has been officially called by the UN. It's not a war crime. You get war crime and then you get war criminals. This is a genocide, which is a step up from that. And people like Assange and many other people many other people that speak out about genocides around the world, about what governments are up to. When the Americans then come out and this woman gets death threats because of the American stance, saying we don't really trust this report and try to call her an anti-Semite, is absolute nonsense.
Well, there was a programme on in 2007, would you believe, on the BBC. I think it was on the either on the World Service or Radio 4 or both, about Jewish terrorism. Martin, can you just say a bit about this? Because, we kind of forget, don't we, that the World War II finished in 1945 in Europe, and then there were people who'd been fighting for the Allies almost immediately turning their guns on the British mandate in Palestine.
Well, in actual fact, the Jabotinskyite right wing in what is now Israel carried on fighting the British Army even as the 8th Army was facing off with Rommel in the Western Desert. So, and of course, Ernie Bevin, who was the Labour Foreign Secretary after the war, was opposed to the creation of the State of Israel for two reasons. A, it was a bad idea, and B, they can't have a state precisely because of the way they've gone about trying to get it, which is basically through terroristic methods. I mean, the Irgun and the Haganah were extremely well-organised terrorists.
Is this Ernie Bevin from Bristol?
That's right. Ernie Bevin built his political career in Bristol. He's actually originally from the West Country, but he came down here as a teenager, started work, and he built up the Transport and General Workers Union here in Bristol. And as a young man, he stood on the docks down in the harbour there and made a speech against the First World War as an imperialist war, and that he won the vote. But of course, he then later became Foreign Secretary, and he was the one who gave Britain nuclear weapons, for example. But of course, he was opposed to the creation of the State of Israel, and he said, we're not just going to cut and run here. We're going to stay, and we're going to defend the Palestinian population. And he was an imperialist. He thought if the Israelis were allowed to do this, then maybe the Kenyans would start doing it as well. So his attitude was, Britain can't be seen to back down to this kind of intimidation. Well, of course, he was overruled.
And he'd been doing that sort of intimidation to get these territories in the first place. Look,
yes.
Just like the lady Francesca Albanese, she has been. This is from the United Nations, the Special Rapporteur on Human Rights in Palestine. Hell of a job, that one. But she has been being threatened. She's announced that she's been getting threats. She doesn't actually say death threats, but threats of some sort or another, because she's trying to take. But a similar sort of thing was going on with people like Ernie Bevin, and even Winston Churchill, who was having problems with the Zionists. Whenever they spoke out, and this programme, it's part of the document series on the BBC. Everyone likes to moan about the BBC, but back in 2007, there was quite a good programme once, and this is about the Jewish terrorists and also their 1946 plan to actually assassinate the guy Martin's talking about, Foreign Secretary Ernest Bevin.
In a small apartment commanding panoramic views for more than 15 miles along Israel's Golden Sand coastline lives Benjamin Gepner. Now in his 90s, Gepner won medals for fighting the Nazis after joining the British Army. But when that fight was over, he returned to Palestine to wage war on his former comrades as a fighter for Stern. He was soon to become the group's head of operations in the USA, from where he organised the acquisition and dispatch of explosives for use in Stern Gang bombing campaigns. One of these, he tells me, was the aerial bomb attack on the House of Commons.
There was a Jewish man who was very popular in America. He was called Rabbi Korff, Korff. He helped us. He called me one day and he said, I'm going to France. What will you do in France? He didn't tell me. I said, well, what hotel will you be in? He told me what hotel, Carillon. I remember Carillon. So I immediately notified our men in France, Korff will be in Carillon and so on. So they contacted him and he told them, look, I am ready to finance a plane that will throw a bomb and throw it on London.
But what about the plot to kill Britain's Foreign Secretary Ernest Bevin? Was Gepner involved in that as well?
Well, I was notified that our people in England needed explosives. I sent them in a radio set. I sent them the explosives.
What operation were those explosives destined for?
I thought Bevin.
Gepner confirms that Yakov Haruti, the man I've been trying to trace in Tel Aviv, was the man sent to kill Bevin in London, and the one responsible for sending the parcel bomb that was supposed to kill Captain Roy Farron, but inadvertently killed his brother Rex instead.
We deeply deplored the death of his brother. His brother was an innocent man, and it was terrible things that happened that he had opened the book which was intended for his brother.
Because he had the same initial, didn't he?
Yes.
So he sort of finishes off there talking about a letter bomb. This is something which was invented by the various Jewish terrorist gangs in the 1940s. But it does show that the entire birth of the State of Israel, not only was it intertwined with Britain and the Empire, but it was also extremely bloody for the Brits. You would think that potentially Bevin's view, maybe you want to say something about this, Martin, would be a much more widely known and general view that obviously we're not going to deal with these people because they're killing our people, and there's no way that we're going to allow this. But of course, there's the fact that everyone almost was fed up with fighting after World War II. They just sort of think, oh well, let's just walk away, and they did.
Well, of course, the recognition of the State of Israel in I think it was the 48 resolution. It was really supported by the United States because they've been very heavily lobbied by the Israelis, the Israeli state to be, as it were. So, for example, most Jewish refugees inside Western Europe, when they were asked where do they want to go, they said, we want to go to the United States of America. That's where we want to go. And Roosevelt was quite cushy with that. He's saying, well, they'll be useful members of this community. They've got an established place here. Well, why can't they can come here? But the Israeli lobbied that they had to go to Israel. So, for example, a lot of the people on the Exodus, which was a big film was written about it, they didn't want to go to Israel. They were being forced to go there, and in fact, they were under heavy manners from the gun on the ship. And the Haganah actually sunk a ship with refugees in it because they said they didn't want to land in Israel. They wanted to go somewhere else, so they sank the ship. That's how vicious they were. And I don't think we should be calling them Jewish terrorists because that implies that it's their Jewishness that made them terrorists, which is not the case.
I think that's the way they were described at the time. That's why
they might even describe themselves as that, but I don't think we should describe them.
Okay, fine. Yeah.
I mean, interestingly enough, I spoke many years ago at Speaker's Corner in 91 against that particular war, and I had a fairly good audience listening to what I was saying. And I said at one stage, and Marek Edelman this morning called for the withdrawal of Israeli forces from all occupied territories in Israel and Palestine. And I was a Zionist in the audience, and they piped and said, well, who's he then? Some self-hating Jew, I suppose. And I said he was the commander of the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising.
Yes.
And he's just died a couple of years ago, and he was always opposed to Zionism. He said there's no basis whatsoever. I'm Jewish, I'm Polish, I'm from Warsaw, and we're not going anywhere. And it's not acceptable for people to go to a place like Palestine and try and take it off the locals. Totally unacceptable to me. And of course he survived the Warsaw Uprising, and then he became a doctor, and he lived under the communist regime as a doctor, and then eventually he joined Solidarność and was part of the general movement for liberation in Poland.
Warren, what do you make of the sort of birth of this? What we've got now, this genocide, it's been getting ready to go really since the 1940s, possibly, some say even further back than that, into the 19th century.
Yeah, absolutely. You had Lord Palmerston, first of all. Let's be absolutely honest. Lord Palmerston in 1840 wanted to challenge Egypt because obviously the Suez Canal was being built, and then you go back to money. And that was obviously completed in 1858. Then you had obviously the 1920s where you had lots of British involvement in the butchering and the movement of moving Palestinian people. 1927 you had Weizmann and the Austrian writer who first termed Zionism, and remember that Jews, Christians, everybody was able to live on that land without any problems whatsoever until all of a sudden this
thousands of years back.
Yes, for thousands of years.
But I think there were a bit of trouble during the Crusades. But
yes, there was obviously, But once again, who was the cause of that problem? Once again, it was
the European powers. Absolutely right. Yeah.
And the thing that you have to look at there is when they lobbied so hard, and obviously Martin is right with everything that he's saying there that then happened in the 40s, and they really started to ramp up then. And we've had 80 years of this. Now, I don't care what anybody says. You can condemn Hamas for October the 7th all you like. What about condemning us in Britain for what we did all those years ago and continue to do right up till October the 7th? The actual Zionist state of Israel, because I believe Jews and Zionists are completely different. I really do. The state of Israel is a Zionist state. Jewish people, you have so many Jewish people speaking out.
People are interested in that. Alan Hart, who we interviewed on this show a couple of times, and he was very, very negative about the prospects for peace in the Middle East. He was the former BBC, I think actually an ITN correspondent in the Middle East, met Golda Meir many times and people like that. His whole attitude, in fact, his book, his whole series that he published back in the noughties was Zionism, the Real Enemy of the Jews.
Yes.
Which was a massive double page. But I mean, he was an incredibly knowledgeable guy, but he said, look, no, this problem ain't going away. It's just going to be getting worse and worse.
It's not, because here's the very straightforward thing. You talk about the war crimes and everything else. If you kill any child, it doesn't matter what flag you're standing under. You're a war criminal or a terrorist or whatever. But here's the thing. Zionism is an ideology. Jewishness is a faith. They are totally different.
Isn't a faith an ideology?
Not really. Not really. No, you see, if you have this ideology, if you look at Zionism and this, that and the other, and you see these people that are in charge now, they will call for absolutely anything. You've got Jewish people speaking out against this.
Yeah, it certainly seems to me that the current incumbents, the Netanyahus of this world, are just using the faith and abusing it. What do you make of this whole idea of Zionism and Judaism, Martin?
Well, Zionism is a secular nationalist movement in the first place, although it's now evolved a religious dimension. I think it's, there's nothing wrong with people having, there used to be moderate Zionists. I mean, like Rabin, for example, who was prepared to put some compromises in, but he was assassinated.
Well, look what happened to him.
Yes, that's right. And of course he was assassinated by his own security forces. It wasn't just a random person.
Well, it was someone...
the Prime Minister is addressing his own party political conference.
He was linked to Netanyahu and Likud.
Well, that's right. So, but in any case, I'm afraid, when we had Dr. Chris on earlier, he was saying, well, most ordinary Israelis don't support what's happening, and I'm afraid that's not the case.
Yes.
The Palestinian ambassador came to speak in Bristol some years ago now, and he was a Christian, and he said, well, look, I'll be honest with you about the Israelis. 10% of them are very much on our side. We work with them every day. We trust them completely. They're very much the right people, and we're very, very, very pleased to work with them. But it is only 10%. The other 90% are blind to what it is very difficult.
Maybe things have changed a bit. George Galloway was quoted, I think it was last year, sometimes saying roughly 80%. But anyway, let's have we're looking at a little bit of history here. So, a fascinating year for me, and it's very difficult for me to go through an entire show without mentioning Martin Bormann, Hitler's private secretary. There's quite a good YouTube out. This guy that I'm not sure of his name, but he does military history YouTubes. He's just a couple of months ago produced another one about the history of Martin Bormann. Now, for those that don't know, it was Hitler's private secretary who was working during the Second World War. He was made much more powerful when Rudolf Hess, who was he decided to get in a Messerschmitt and fly to the UK to try and do a peace deal that was never going to happen, probably, because he thought there might be a coup against the British and he was needed for it. Anyway, he got out of the way, but Bormann then became much more powerful in the Nazi party. He was the Reichsleiter, the party leader, and he made all the decisions about who got promoted and who didn't, and also he controlled access to Adolf Hitler himself. Yeah. But the real dilemma over the years was started started by a Bristol journalist, a Jewish Bristol journalist, a guy called Stuart Stephen, who was working here on the Western Daily Press, and then he got a job up at the Daily Express, and it was his byline on the story, Martin Bormann is alive. In 1972, he'd got photographs, and he'd been working with Ladislas Frago, Hungarian journalist, freelance journalist and photographer, and actually got a photograph, or maybe some, at least one, of Bormann in Buenos Aires. So all this story that had been put out suddenly had to change. And in 1972, the German authorities suddenly discovered Martin Bormann's skull in Berlin. Just a few, literally a couple of weeks after this story broke in the Daily Express. So this is one of the topics which, and also, of course, the BND. Martin, actually, let's get you to your take on this. The German Secret Services. Wasn't it Reinhard Gehlen who was?
Reinhard Gehlen was the head of the Gestapo in Eastern Europe, and at the end of the war, he went to the Americans and the British and he said, "Look, I've got loads of spies in Russia. Do you want my spy network?" And they said, "Well, now you come to mention it, perhaps we do." And they made him the head of the BND. Now, I've got no particular brief for Joe Stalin or anybody associated with him, but you can see from a Russian point of view, this is pretty clear indication of the direction of travel, isn't it? So this guy who's in head of spying on us during the war, you've made him the head of your intelligence service. He's a Nazi, you know.
Yes.
And you've made him the head of your intelligence service. That's a pretty clear signal of where we're going.
I mean, the point is that the BND were the people who were involved in finding and discovering Bormann's skull, allegedly. Anyway, let's have a listen now to a clip from this new thing about the hunt for Martin Bormann, which looks also at the skulls having been tampered with that were discovered.
The BND was founded in 1956 by Gehlen from an earlier post-war group he called the Org, formed from a number of Abwehr, SS and Gestapo agents. It worked exclusively with the CIA. Gehlen remained in charge of West German intelligence until 1968. A very large number of Nazi war crime suspects found employment with the BND, including many intimately involved with the Holocaust. This was all ignored by the CIA and indeed by the West German government in the Cold War against East Germany and the USSR. It is not beyond the realms of possibility that some BND men were still sympathetic to the old regime and maintained some secret contacts with Nazi networks in South America. The discovery of Martin Bormann's skull in West Berlin in 1972 allowed the West German government to state that Bormann had never escaped justice, as it had maintained all along, and justified its curious inaction for hunting for Bormann in the intervening decades. It also conveniently ended public interest in looking for Nazi war criminals, as the admission that the hunt for Bormann had been nothing more than chasing shadows was sure to end public fascination in the subject, and allow West Germany to put the war once and for all behind it and get on with the European project and the creation of the new Germany. Certainly the discovery of Bormann's remains in 1972 was very convenient for the West Germans, conspiracy or no conspiracy, hence its great haste in declaring Bormann legally dead in 1973 and its rubbishing of any evidence that ran contrary to its official line. Scenario number 3 is linked to number 2. In this scenario, Bormann's remains were planted in West Berlin by shadowy Nazis or their neo-Nazi helpers, in order to take the heat off them in South America. Again, the discovery of Bormann's skull and its identification was once more very convenient for the wanted men hiding in various South American nations since the late 1940s. The last important Nazi fugitive had actually never left Berlin, according to the official story. So who cared about the underlings whose names hardly anyone knew? Nazi hunting continued after 1972, of course, particularly the hunt for Dr. Josef Mengele, but never with the same fever pitch of press excitement as during the Bormann years. Neither scenarios 2 or 3 were impossible. With careful planning and some knowledge, it could have been done. But if it was done, whoever did it made mistakes. Someone ignored the significance of different soil types. Someone tried to tidy up the Stumpfegger's skull, so it conformed to the official story, which was, of course, based entirely upon the unreliable testimony of a Nazi, Hitler Youth leader Arthur Axmann, and Axmann alone. Someone didn't realize that Bormann's dentition could have changed from 1945. Perhaps the operation was done in haste, as it was important to get the Bormann remains found and identified before the Urlaub fairground site was redeveloped in West Berlin. It can be suggested that both skulls had evidence of having been worked on. Stumpfegger's skull showed signs of having had a portion excised for some unknown reason. Bormann's skull had a missing lower bridge, which was eventually found 3 months later after the site had been repeatedly searched. Bormann's skull was encased in a reddish-brown clay that was not found in Berlin. This material was washed off before it could be properly tested. Bormann's jaw showed clear evidence of post-1945 dental work. The bodies were discovered in a position completely different to that noted by Arthur Axmann and in locations some distance from where post office workers testified that they had buried them. Both jaws contained glass fragments from cyanide capsules, but the capsules were different from those used by the SS at the end of the war. These and several other points have never been properly addressed by the German government.
Well, let's do that right now. I mean, I'll just say one thing. If you've ever read OPJB by Christopher Creighton, aka Christopher Creighton, his real name John Ainsworth Davis, he explains that they got this Bormann double body, and in order to make it look like he'd taken cyanide, they took a British cyanide pill and stuck it in his mouth when they left his body in Berlin on whatever it was, the 1st of May 1945. So that's why the cyanide capsule doesn't match up. Always, a lot of this, of course, is you've really got to get the extremely readable OPJB. And there were really two main books which explain what happened at the end of the Second World War with Hitler's private secretary and Churchill's private secretary. And that's the one I just mentioned, OPJB, which was published in the mid-1990s. And in the mid-80s, there was another book published by Paul Manning called Martin Bormann, Nazi in Exile. And whilst he was sitting over there in South America, Martin Bormann was setting up 750 companies, laundering the Nazi gold loot through Sullivan and Cromwell's law firm in New York. And most cleverly, as he was putting the money into the companies, he was also appointing Jews, in many cases, to be chairs of those companies, to disguise the fact that it was Nazi money that had made them. Anyway, I'll put a link up to the full version of that on our show page, and obviously the video as well, because there's a lot of it is video evidence on that one. And we'll be back in a minute to talk about the Moscow terrorist attack that happened last Friday.
He was in agony when he prayed in Gethsemane. For the price it was to pay seemed too much for him. He contemplated the price to be paid for humanity. And even the Almighty turned his back at him. They used to love to stay with the master, but now they consider him a disaster. The ones who cried, Hosanna, Hosanna, same ones who led him straight to Golgotha. Judas was too quick to betray him. Peter couldn't wait to deny him. The world at large will reject him. Tell me what you want to do to him. But why didn't the Jews know he's the King of Kings? When even the stars and the kings know he's the King of Kings. The sun and the moon knows his authority, because he told them once and they be standing still. They hung him high, stretched him wide. He hung his head and then he died. But that's not how the story ends. On the top the he rose again. Jesus Christ the Son of God. Oh yes, oh yes. Hallelujah, he arose. Oh yes, oh yes. Hallelujah, he arose. The Prince of Peace arose. Hallelujah, he arose. Oh yes, oh yes. Jesus Christ the Son of God. Oh yes, oh yes. Hallelujah, he arose. Oh yes. Sunday morning. He was still in the tomb on the Sunday morning. Death had him in his womb on the Sunday morning.
Mary was weeping, the gods were watching.
Why do you seek for the living amongst the dead? Though he died like a lamb, but he's still not dead. Cause even in the grave he's got over death. Now we have the victory over death. I see an angel of the Lord come down from heaven. He wrote us to the world like a little pebble. Who is the King of glory? The Lord God strong and mighty. He arose. Where is thy victory? He arose. Where is thy sting? He arose. Every stone has been rolled away.
He's no longer in the grave.
They hung him high, stretched him wide. He hung his head and then he died. But that's not how the story ends. On the third day he rose again.
Jesus Christ, the Son of God. Yes, oh yes. Hallelujah, he arose. Yes, oh yes. Hallelujah, he arose. The Prince of Peace arose. Hallelujah, he arose. Oh yes, oh yes. Jesus Christ, the Son of God. Yes, oh yes. Hallelujah, he arose. Yes, oh yes. Hallelujah, he arose. The Prince of Peace arose. Hallelujah, he arose. Oh yes, oh yes.
At this point the sun refused to shine upon this awful scene, and humanity has lost hope because all they saw was the cross and his bleeding victim. Their future seemed to be darkened with despair as they watched him laid in the tomb, hands folded on his breast, his eyes shut and his lips seeming forever silent. They watched as a heavy stone was rolled against the entrance of the tomb, and a guard of 100 soldiers around the sepulchre. Permit me to say, Jesus was very dead, but that was not how the story ended. For 3 days later, early Sunday morning, there was a mighty earthquake, for an angel of the Lord has descended from the heavens. His eyes as lightning, and his raiment as white as snow. For the fear of him, the gods did shake and fall down like dead men. Brave soldiers that have never been afraid of human power, taking captives without sword or spear. For the face that they beheld today was not the face of a mortal warrior, but the face of the captain of the Lord's army, the power of his resurrection. They watched as he rolled away the heavy stone, as one will roll away a tiny pebble, and Jesus stepped out of the grave proclaiming, "Oh death, where is thy sting? Oh grave, where is thy victory? Open up your gates and let the King of glory come on in." Who is the King of glory? He's the Lord God, strong and mighty. Who is the King of glory? Come on, these kings of peace. That's the way to go. The story ends, and but of the heroes again.
Jesus Christ, the Son of God. Yes, oh yes. Hallelujah, he arose. Yes, oh yes. Hallelujah, he arose. The Prince of Peace arose. Hallelujah, he arose. Oh yes, oh yes. Jesus Christ, the Son of God. Oh yes, oh yes. Hallelujah, he arose. Yes, oh yes. Hallelujah,
snippet of Jesus Wants Me for a Sunbeam in the middle of that. I don't know if you noticed it. One of my favourite tunes, actually. I love it. A friend of mine at school used to sing it at the top of his voice. So that was Resurrection by Sam Song. I suppose it's a little bit more of an Easter Sunday song than a Good Friday song. And also, of course, you've got The Saint by Orbital right at the very end there. Welcome back to Not the BCFM Politics Show with Irish Republican Labour activist Martin Summers and me, Tony Gosling. Joining us still is Warren Thornton. Now, Warren, let's just get your take on this terrorist attack. 135 people killed in this Crocus Theatre in Moscow, on the outskirts of Moscow. Just take us through it. What do you think was the purpose? Who did it? And how do we know that?
Okay. Well, we, as I say, we're very, very lucky to have sources inside Ukraine, America as well, very close to the State Department. And we know exactly where they were headed for. They were headed for a place called Shotska, which
so this is after they committed these attacks. They hopped in the car.
They were headed towards
And it was just 4
Ukraine
people
border.
involved, is it?
No, there were 4 people involved. There's another 11 have been arrested. Over 35 people have been arrested in Turkey. In fact, one of the handlers who helped the finances in cryptocurrency and money was funneling that through Ukraine. So let's go through what we know. So first of all, let's begin at the beginning. The USA sent out a very, very simple, straightforward what they call a generic warning. So in other words, please do not use, don't go into any large crowded places. Now, they were very specific. Now, America have said lots of things about we can't talk specifically to the attacks, but they were very specific. When you see the warning, it says concerts and other places. Now, that's very, very important. And it was only...
So this is like Manchester Arena or something like that?
Yes, exactly that. So it's... And then they only put the warning out, and it also said for 48 hours. Now, this was designed to be on the 7th so that it would actually impact the Russian elections. They couldn't do it because security was so strong that they couldn't get on there. Now, one of the terrorists was actually photographed on the 7th outside the venue, and obviously they couldn't carry that forward.
So they obviously looked at it, said, the security's too tight today, it's a walk away.
It's a walk away. Now it's very important that you remember that the Americans, when they wanted to get out the German Taurus leaks, we know for an absolute fact through our embassy sources that you do it through a back channel. So what they did was they gave that to Great Britain, from the US Air Force. They gave it to Great Britain. They gave it to Singapore, who gave it to China, then gave it to Russia. That's how a back channel at an embassy works. Okay. Consequently, Singapore were very upset at being used like that, and then actually told everybody the Americans are flowing F-35s over the Baltic Sea. And of course, the Americans came out and said there's no F-35s in Ukraine, but that wasn't what they said. They said they were over the Baltic.
So what were the Taurus leaks?
So the Taurus leaks were when the German officers were discussing about using these Taurus missiles to strike inside of Russia. And of course, the Scholz and Baerbock are at odds in the German government over this nonsense, and they were so convinced that they actually delivered 5 of these Taurus missiles without the guidance system on the 4th of February. It was decided on the 19th they were delivered, because they were so sure at the Munich conference between the 16th and the 18th that they were going to get Scholz to agree to it, that they'd already set the delivery in motion. And that simply wasn't the case. So when you want to do a back channel, that is with everybody inside an hour. So you think going through 5 different embassies, that can be done in an hour. Okay, and they're saying that they let the Russians know. They didn't let the Russians know. We have it from our German embassy source that the Germans didn't know. And Scholz has actually come out and said that. So very simply, there you have the USA being very specific about when the attack is and where it's going to happen. Okay, then you have the terrorists actually photographed outside there. Then you find that the cryptocurrency, which we've now got sources saying that they were paid in money and cryptocurrency, and we know for an absolute fact, and this is for your guys on the show, and we're going to talk about it tomorrow, that they were also tracking the mobile phones that were used in this Renault, and they actually made a call to the SVU, which were placed in Shotska, which is just across the Ukrainian border, across the border there. That they were going to meet up and they were going to be taken in 3 cars from Shotska. They were going to go from Shotska to meet at the border. They were literally going to transfer into those cars and then be whisked.
So how would they actually get across the border? You seem to be implying that they could just drive into Ukraine.
Very, very simply because Ukraine knew, and they were going to make sure that there was no problem with getting across the border.
Well, there might be a problem with the Russian side.
Yeah, there might be a problem with the Russian side, but remember that the intel that was supplied to them was supplied by America, so they knew where the gaps were. Why do you think there's so many planes flying up over the Baltic Sea?
Oh, I see. So we know a bit about how they were. I mean, it doesn't sound to me like the biggest kind of jihadist kind of operation here.
Absolutely not.
That's what we were told, ISIS, straight away.
Okay, so let's unpack that straight away. It's got no hallmarks of ISIS whatsoever. Nowhere in the world, anybody who's an ISIS terrorist holds up their left hand to take the pledge. Okay, it's always the right hand. And when the mistake was pointed out, they doctored the photographs, mirrored the photographs, and of course, the Arabic writing on the banners behind was backwards. So we knew that they'd done that. It was amateur hour at best. And the other thing you have to remember is they blurred out all the faces, and when you're doing the martyrdom, there's always a video beforehand. There are many, many other things that they do not do. They do not use this type of video conferencing.
So what was the motive then?
The motive is very, very simple, was to disrupt or really upset the whole of the election, and was to say to Russia, we can strike at you anytime.
But they had a team in there that decided they couldn't do the attack, but they did one a couple of days later instead. But for the individuals involved, since it wasn't religion, we like to do that, isn't it, mice, Martin, our little, the way that the people get motivated.
That's what we were told by Andy Masham, who used to work for MI5, that they were told mice is the way you coerce, get people to do it. Money, ideology, ego, and money, ideology, coercion, ego.
Yes, and money was the main factor in this.
So how much were they paid, do you know?
We know that in cryptocurrency, between all the people that were involved in this, there was over $1 million worth of cryptocurrency.
And right up the other end, who is it you think is masterminding this?
Oh, the USA are behind it, the CIA are behind this. There's absolutely no question whatsoever. And we have our source, who is very, very close in the intelligence community in America, saying everybody was panicking because they pushed the button too early. When they said it was ISIS-K, first of all, ISIS don't do that. And of course, Afghanistan have come out and said it was nothing to do with them whatsoever. They pushed the button early because they obviously thought that they were going to get to safety. They didn't get to safety. They got intercepted, and of course that's when the whole narrative started to fall apart.
You get the impression, don't you, from that the Russians were watching what was going on and decided at the last minute to swoop in. So let's have a listen now to Alistair Crook. Do you want to say something about him, Martin? Because I'm sure you're aware of him.
Well, Alistair Crook's based out in Lebanon, I believe, but he was a British diplomat on the sort of, spooky side of diplomacy, sort of the MI6 sort of side of diplomacy, and of course he's very severely critical of Western foreign policy. I don't always agree with everything he says. I think some of his cultural stuff is a bit, flaky, but the basic factual stuff, he's a good source for basic factual stuff.
He ran something in Beirut called the Conflicts Forum, and he's, I think, a pretty sharp commentator. I don't think we've had him on this programme before, which is pretty remiss of me. I suppose I should whack myself for that. Sorry, folks. But anyway, he had some quite interesting points to make about this.
I remember at one point I went to Washington and gave a talk in Washington, and I said, look, this firing up of these Islamic radicals in order to hurt Russia. Some of those groups, some of those Islamic movements, okay, but others are going to be a huge danger to us in the future, these Islamist radicals. And it'll end up in our cities too. You need to differentiate between the ones that are okay and the ones that are dangerous to their own people, let alone dangerous to us. Anyway, a senator took me by the shoulder and he said, thank you for this warning, Alistair, but, those groups you're warning us about, they sure kick communist ass. And I think probably, it's quite possible that someone in the intelligence community in America has been saying, look, this thing is going out of control. We have, attacks into Belgorod, we have attacks into Crimea, we have attacks on refineries in Russia, we have these drones hitting Moscow, this can get out of control and can get very dangerous. And that's why we had these warnings coming and saying suddenly, the White House is saying, these bizarre actions by Ukraine have got to stop. These attacks on the refineries have got to stop. And I think, someone was saying, maybe this is getting out of control and, something bad might happen. And something bad, it looks as if it has happened. And that's why we see such panic in America and Europe. I mean, they are not doubling down on the ISIS-K story. I mean, they're absolutely going flat out on the ISIS-K story. And I can tell you these people were not jihadists because I've looked at the videos, and I know what these jihadists are like. I've actually, I've been with jihadists, so I know. First of all, jihadists generally go on shooting until they're killed. They are martyrs. They want to be martyrs. They don't plan an exit and grab a car and head off down south. I mean, that's very much unlike it. Secondly, this is Ramadan, and they don't usually do this during a holy month, start killing civilians like this. Anyway, it's fairly clear these people did it for money. They were recruited, first of all, in Tajikistan. Incidentally, there's a major, not only a U.S. embassy in Tajikistan, but there's a Ukrainian embassy there. And the ambassador is the former head of Ukrainian intelligence in Kiev. Now, I'm not suggesting anything because we don't know at this stage, but I would say it's highly unlikely these were jihadists. They didn't act as jihadists. They didn't operate in that way. Clearly, the whole attack was pre-planned, was organized, the weapons were put in, and apparently all of this was done by Telegram channel. It wasn't done directly. There wasn't any direct interaction between the actual perpetrators and the people who were behind the scenes providing the weapons and other parts. And then they headed off and the Russians let them go. I mean, it was, bizarrely badly organized in respect. I mean, they arrived in a white Sigma car with a black roof, which is quite rare, I'm told, in Moscow. And then they arrived in that with their weapons and started shooting wildly. And then they tried to escape in the same car. Well, of course, a white car with a black roof and a Renault Sigma was quite obvious. And the Russians just followed it. They wanted to see where it was going, who they might be contacting, who they might meet. And then finally, when it was quite clear they were heading through Bryansk down to Ukraine, at that time they stopped the car in a forest because they didn't want these people getting out and taking hostages or shooting civilians in the process. So they stopped it in a forest, and then one of them was detained then, and the others ran into the forest where they were subsequently caught alive. I think they'd already dumped their weapons by that point. So a very badly executed, but obviously carefully planned, pre-planned operation.
That's Alistair Crook there, speaking about the Crocus Theatre terrorist attack last Friday, this time last week, Warren. I mean, it does sound like quite a professional operation by the Russians, so they maybe could have nabbed them quite close to the venue as they tried to make their getaway, but they actually sat, I imagine, with satellites, drones or whatever, sitting watching the car. Where are they going? Because the idea is that they're trying to find out a little bit more about who these people are and their motives.
Yeah, absolutely. And they also made a phone call from inside that car across to people in Shotska who were the SBU waiting for them. Now, here's where the amateur hour comes in here. As a person who's taken part in a special op, if you are going to a foreign country and you know that you are going to be captured in that country, you have two things that are going to happen to you. You're either getting clean away or you're dead. There is no way in hell that you can be, how can I put it, be captured alive or captured in any way where you can give out any information. The fact that they didn't destroy these mobile phones, that they found 3 of them out of the 4 that were on these terrorists, this is absolute amateur hour. And obviously they still had lots and lots of details on these phones, and the Russians have, as we said on our show on the front line a couple of days ago, the Russians have it all, absolutely everything. And as much as, and I don't know whether you've noticed, but America are ramping up the Ukraine had nothing to do with it, they had nothing to do with it. We've had Miller come out, we've had Jean-Pierre come out and say it, and it is absolutely untrue, because they were defending Ukraine left, right and centre. It is absolutely obvious. We have the paperwork, there's a paper trail that shows that Ukraine were actually paying these people in cryptocurrency through Turkey.
Yeah, well, that's hopefully very clear to all our listeners. Martin, before we hear from you about the sort of general geopolitics of how this fits into the whole Russia-Ukraine NATO conflict, let's have a listen to the Russian President Vladimir Putin's response, or at least a part of it anyway, that he gave immediately after the attacks, or the day after.
I declare March 24 a day of national mourning. In Moscow and the Moscow region, in all regions of the country, additional anti-terrorist and anti-sabotage measures have been introduced. The main thing now is to prevent those who are behind this bloodbath from committing a new crime. As for the investigation of this crime and the results of operational search actions, at present we can say the following. All 4 direct perpetrators of this terrorist attack, all those who shot, who killed people, they were found and detained. They tried to hide. They were moving towards Ukraine, where, according to preliminary data, a window had been prepared for them on the Ukrainian side to cross the state border. A total of 11 people were detained. The Federal Security Service of Russia and other law enforcement agencies are working to identify and uncover the entire accomplice base of the terrorists, those who provided them with transport, who planned escape routes from the crime scene, who prepared caches of weapons and ammunition. I will repeat. Investigative and law enforcement agencies will do everything to establish all the details of this crime. But it is already obvious that we are faced not just with a carefully and cynically planned terrorist attack, but with a prepared and organized mass murder of peaceful, defenseless people. The criminals calmly and purposefully set out to kill, to shoot at point-blank range our citizens, our children. Just like the Nazis once carried out massacres in the occupied territories.
So that's Russian President Vladimir Putin, just with an announcement to the Russian people about this horrific terror attack with 4 armed men with automatic weapons, just killing as many innocent civilians as they could at the Crocus Theatre on the outskirts of Moscow, Martin. But, is it a bit too much for me to suggest that maybe this is an act of desperation by the United States, that they feel that the whole business with Ukraine is not going their way, so they're lashing out like a kind of cornered lion?
Well, Victoria Nuland, if you remember her, the Cookie Queen, she gave a press conference in the middle of the night in a street in Kiev some while ago, just as before she's resigned. I think she's still in post.
No, she's all
yes,
out
I know, but I think she was still in post at that stage. And she said, well, we've got some nasty surprises for the Russians. And I think that the Russians are very well aware that because, the British are very much in the frame in all of this, because they have got, basically they've got their infrastructure, that Gladio-style infrastructure already in place inside Russia, and
What do you mean by that? The British have got Gladio infrastructure in Russia?
Yes. I mean, people don't realise how involved the British are. The Russians are very clear that the British are. When Zakharchenko, who was the Prime Minister of the Donbass Republic, he was killed, and we interviewed people who knew about this, because he was the Prime Minister, elected guy. He used to go for lunch every day at a restaurant across the road, and there was a bomb in a light fitting in the hallway, which is a very professional hit. Just blew his head off. I see the role of British Special Forces all over that. I'm afraid that's definitely their style, and they're the people who, and of course they've been training the Ukrainians in all of this. Yeah. And this false flag terrorism has been a kind of NATO standard operating procedure going back decades now. I mean, with the Gladio films that were made in the 90s made it absolutely clear what was going on in Italy and so on. But of course, mainstream Middle England can't quite get their heads around all of this because it just does not compute with the sort of, the kind of bubble that they live in. But of course, the Russians, the Russian population and the Russian state are very much on this case because they're very well aware of what's behind it.
How do you think it fits into the wider conflict, this sort of action?
Well, very, very simply, we know that they've been carrying out these sort of attacks in the Donbass since 2014. So, terror attacks by the CIA, MI6, Ukrainian SBU are nothing new. Remember that when Poroshenko, when Victoria Nuland helped to overthrew with the National Endowment of Democracy, overthrew the Ukrainian government, then Poroshenko was in charge, and Poroshenko turned round on a live video and said, we will make their children hide in cellars. So then the Azov battalions carried out all sorts of horrific attacks against these people, over 14,000 civilians killed. So terror attacks are nothing new for these guys whatsoever. What America and Britain have had then is a bunch of neo-Nazi guys who are more than willing to carry this out. These are not easy people to find, people who are going to kill this. What I would say is for one second, say you look at 9/11, and there are many people who think there's nothing to see there, and there's many people who are conspiracy theorists or whatever, and there's many people that believe that there's something wrong with that. If they're willing to do that to 3,000 Americans, how much do you think they're going to be upset about doing that to 140 Muscovites? It's really, we have to get over the idea that we're the good guys all the time. For instance, ever since I was a child, we were brought up to think Russia is bad, China is evil, this, that and the other. It's a propaganda game. They don't care. The war isn't coming to their shores. There is no... America... Kissinger said it best. He turned around and he said, being an enemy of America is a bad idea. Being a friend of America is absolutely lethal. And he's absolutely right, because at the end of the day, if Europe gets wiped out in a war where NATO are not able to fight this, we are hearing every single day, literally the shells that Britain could give the Ukrainians, they would burn through in 17 minutes per day. So all the shells that Britain have at the moment, and they gave them to the Ukrainians, 17 minutes later they'd be out of shells. So we can't manufacture stuff. Russia are winning incrementally, and the bombing now. If you look at the map, I've got a map, and I get reports in from people who are in those areas in Ukraine, and the map is brown and red. Russia are absolutely, since the Moscow, obviously the Moscow terror attack, Russia are absolutely pounding Ukraine's infrastructure. Now they've hit the transport links. Now they're hitting the electricity grid, because now that the transportation of these things, and when we talk about we need to arm, it's complete nonsense, because you're talking 61 billion that the Americans wouldn't give to them. Well, they lost 17 billion pounds worth of air defence systems in a week, blown up by the Russians. You're talking about 3 Patriot systems, a couple of other systems as well. It's absolutely
hang on.
nonsense.
On the other side, there's the destruction of, something like 2/3 of the Black Sea Fleet is now at the bottom.
Are they?
Yes, in Sevastopol.
Yeah, let's have a look at what they hit the other day in Sevastopol. They hit 2 ships.
Did it not go down then?
No. So what we've got is they've hit three ships in dry dock. The other day they said they'd hit this huge ship that was in Sevastopol. And what they'd actually done, the satellite photos totally showed that not to be the case. What they'd done was they'd hit a floating platform in dry dock, and they put a hole in the dockside. How is that sinking 2 ships to the bottom of the ocean? There has been some damage, but only to a couple of craft that you would say are serviceable. And for the moment, that is the only war that they can wage, because they've lost the land war. They've lost the air war. And when the Russians are really serious about capturing the Black Sea, don't think for 1 second that Ukrainians are going to have any chance there.
There seems to be an element of unreality to the Western approach. So why is that?
Because it's a bubble. You see, we're used to, and this is no disrespect to whatsoever, we are used to clattering third-class and fourth-class armies. Whether that be in Afghanistan, whether that be in Iraq. Now you've come up against, and the early warning signs were there, because when they pulled back from Kiev, the Russians, because there was a peace deal on the table, and then Johnson scuppered it, that was the Luhansk and Donetsk People's Republican Army. That's a big difference from the Russian army. And now we're fighting a first-class army who can outsupply, they can outgun, and they can outman. What part of that do you think you are going to win?
Well, it's quite clear. I mean, what's interesting is the failure of military leadership in the West. I mean, Patrick Sanders, who's the head of the British Army, going on about the British public has got to learn that we are going to have to go to war with Russia. And by the way, can we spend some more money on my department, please?
You're talking about conscription, aren't they?
Let's look at conscription, shall we? So, first of all, when you look at the Ukrainian conscription, they're beating people up and throwing them in. There's pregnant women going to the front line. We've shown videos of that. There are people being literally grabbed every single day. There are 20 people a day die trying to swim rivers that are freezing cold to get away from this conscription. Okay, so nobody actually wants to go to war. When you look at the British Army and you look at the NATO armies, we publish figures on this. So in the 32 NATO countries, 103,000 people have left the army in the last year, and only 17,000 have joined up. So you were talking a 5-to-1 leave. And nobody, the records of people actually going to join NATO forces or to join armies now is lower than it's ever been. And of course, you can always get you can get a berth on the great ship Diversity and Inclusion, if you like.
Yeah, I think the idea is that people have just completely lost faith in the idea of the armed forces as there to do anything right or morally correct or proper. That you're basically kind of joining some sort of gang, and you might get. I mean, the morale of people joining must have there must be a major kind of factor in whether people are going to join up or not, and they're not doing it, and they've decided, no, I'm not going to risk my life for these idiots.
Yeah, exactly that, because we're being told F-16s, Bradleys were game changers, Churchill tanks were game changers.
Everything's a game changer.
Yeah, Abrams is a game changer, and as soon as they get on the front line, they burn well. And they get hit. So, as a person, let me ask you, ask both of you, if you're a young man, ideologically driven, and they say, please come and join the armed forces, we'll stick you in a Challenger tank or a Bradley or whatever, you'll go to the front line, and then the next thing you know, one of these drones comes along, and bang, your tank's up in arms. And the levels of death, there's 120,000 people died in Bakhmut inside 8 months. If you put the British Army in Bakhmut, they'd be annihilated then.
So what's the point of it all, Warren?
Well, the point of it, obviously, is to try and weaken Russia, and the whole idea.
Well, it seems to be weakening the West, actually.
Well, that's all it is doing.
It's a bit like the sanctions.
That's all it is doing. Well, you look at the sanctions. We published a video the other day where there's loads of shoe companies like Nike and everything else who, we're no longer being in Moscow. Nonsense. They're under a different name and a different brand, and they're still open. The sanctions don't work. Because, first of all, it's not done anything whatsoever.
So it seems to me like our leaders, our armed forces, are actually, this is not really so much about being anti-Russia, it's about anti-us, anti their domestic population.
Yeah, absolutely. If you have a look at the World Economic Forum agenda, and the whole idea is, and it's written down in the writings of the Club of Rome, the agenda for the 21st century, it's written down that we would have climate problems. We have 4 main tenets: war, then you've got climate, then you've got vaccinations, and then you've got the farming, and of course less food being out there. And what happens when you do all those 4 things? People start dying left, right, and centre. And you only have to look at when you step back and you join the dots and you look at the wider picture. We're going to China next. Okay, because in 4 years' time we're going to have a pro-Chinese Taiwan government. And that is a real problem, because that's when America and Britain and everybody else will kick off. They're already doing the bases out in the Philippines and out in Japan and everything else. So in 3.5 years' time, because remember that the Taiwanese parties those that got elected had to join a coalition to stop the pro-Chinese party getting in.
That's
when
right.
pro-China get in, Martin, that is when America will. This is an hors d'oeuvre. Russia is an hors d'oeuvre, and you notice they've started to pivot away because, as you were saying, Martin, they got rid of Newland, they got rid of so-and-so, the Joint Chiefs of Staff, and now every single person that they put in those positions is a China hater. Every single one of them.
I think the Chinese can see what happened in the Taiwanese presidential election, because it's unlike the Russian presidential election, where if you don't get 50% in the first round, there has to be a runoff. There were two relatively pro-China candidates, and that split their vote, which then allowed the pro-independence candidate, as it were, the US candidate to get in. But the Chinese will be able to read the tea leaves on that, and they will see that in actual fact, the majority of the population in Taiwan does not want to have a fight with us.
Well,
and the Kuomintang, which is the basis of the they're not pro-Chinese, they're nationalist Chinese, but they've got the same line as the communist Chinese on things like the South China Sea. You know, the China's national interests they were in fact in alliance against the Japanese together before the Civil War in the 40s. And the head of one of the KMT visited China just before the election. First time that's ever happened. He went to the grave of Dr. Sun Yat-sen, who's regarded as a hero of China by both nationalists and communists.
Yes.
And
this week,
this thing can be resolved without violence.
We've had a big hoo-ha about China this week, haven't we? We've had Oliver Dowden giving a statement in the House of Commons. The Chinese have hacked into our system of elections and blah, blah, blah.
Of course they have.
Before we hear your comments on any more on China, let's have a listen to the former GCHQ whistleblower, Katharine Gun, now living out in Turkey, because she was, when she was working, she was the woman that blew the whistle on the Iraq War. She was doing Chinese and Mandarin. She was brought up in Taiwan, and she talks a bit about that in the longer version of the interview up on our show page at thisweek.org.uk later, where she explains what her take is on this attempt by Oliver Dowden, Deputy Prime Minister, and the British government to blame China for some sort of hacking into here in British elections.
Personally, I think part of this whole narrative is to make the British public believe that their elections are otherwise free and fair if it weren't for these so-called foreign interference by unsympathetic or hostile nations. Now, they don't, there's one nation that they never discuss in terms of interference in British political spheres of life, and, that's Israel. So the irony is that I think you mentioned it in probably on your shows before, the Alan Duncan diaries that came out in 2021, where he openly names Israel as being, with the deepest fingers in British political spheres. And there's been no investigation of that. I mean, he has probably laid out in more open terms than these allegations of Israeli influence in British politics. So I think, as I was saying, I think part of this is to make the British public believe that the elections in the UK are always free and fair. And I think this is a lie, because we can see from 2015 to 2020 when the UK establishment went after Corbyn. For the first time in, probably in most of our living memories, a politician became a potential candidate to lead Britain, who most would say was the only truly anti-establishment figure. and the whole establishment, including his own party, went after him. Now, that in itself is a clear example of interfering in the whole British government and the systems of government. But nobody, no one accuses anybody of that.
No, they don't like to mention Israel, do they?
No, they don't. Let's face it, the Friends of Israel lobby were very, very quick to get rid of the likes of Chris Williamson, Jeremy Corbyn. And what you have to also remember is 80% of the Conservative Party and 40% of the Labour shadow cabinet have been on trips funded by the Friends of Israel to Israel.
Well, let's just look at Bristol. We've got, is it 5 Labour MPs, Martin?
Yeah.
The only one of them that really is not part of Labour Friends of Israel is Kerry McCarthy. Karen Smith is a Labour Friend of Israel. Sorry, should we say a Labour Friend of Genocidal Israel?
Yes.
Then you've got Darren Jones. He's also a Labour Friend of Genocidal Israel. Thangam Debonair, Labour MP, she's also a friend of Labour Friend of Genocidal Israel. And finally, the new guy, is it Damien Egan, I think,
yes,
up in Kingswood. He's gay and he's married to former Unit 8200 Israeli Signals Intelligence officer.
Yeah, absolutely. And when we looked into it, I mean, we literally went through every single person who've been on one of these trips, to where they take you out and they wine and dine you and everything else. And let's face it as well, you have to look at the links that they have with obviously that lobby as well, and the lobbyists that are around the Houses of Parliament. When we were up there the other week talking to Andrew Bridgen, there were at least 3 pro-Israel lobbyists running around the House of Commons, and that was very, very telling. We went out to a place because obviously there was a bit of a conversation going on, and I spoke to one of the aides there, and he said, this is where we go for a cigarette when we. So I popped out for a cigarette, and of course there was 3 or 4 lobbyists there with MPs. And they were openly just talking about what the plan going forward, and this is what you should be saying. So they were literally schooling them on what to say. And that was something that we shouldn't have been party to, because obviously they didn't know I was a journalist. But to actually hear it going on was quite staggering.
Yeah, Martin, it looks like the plan is to control British politics like the US politics. That's what the Israelis are up to, and they're doing quite well. In fact, maybe they've completely done it.
Well, as you remember, the Al Jazeera sting on Joan, I can't remember her second name now, the MP, Labour MP, and Shai Moffat, who was the Mossad agent, saying, well, we've got £1 million to spend on getting the Labour Party in the line we want it to be, and she was chatting away with him about that. And of course that was exposed. She was very anti-Corbyn, and she resigned from the party and so on.
But the thing is, at the end of the day, you've got a general election coming, haven't you? And the idea is that whoever you vote for, you're voting for Israel, the genocidal Israel folks.
Not necessarily, because of course you don't have to vote Labour or Conservative. You can vote for the SNP, Plaid Cymru, Sinn Féin, Independence, or whatever. You see, I mean, this issue of the ceasefire is becoming the big cleavage in British politics, and of course the campaign group of MPs did vote for a ceasefire. That's what they, the Labour Party is being disciplined, so even Labour councillors can't come to the demonstrations that we're holding.
No, exactly.
Otherwise they're going to be sacked.
Do you know the most?
Which is extraordinary if you think about it. I mean, why can't Labour councillors go to a pro-Palestine demonstration by their constituents? It's absurd.
Exactly. I'll tell you the telling thing was obviously in the by-election in Rochdale. It wasn't that George Galloway won. It was the fact that an independent came second, and he had exactly double the votes of the Conservative and Labour combined.
It sounds to me like you're saying it may be a chaotic general election.
Oh, I hope so. Oh, don't you? I mean, let's face it. As we spoke to Andrew Bridgen, and he said, because when you're talking about the vaccines, whether you're talking about Gaza or whatever, he said they don't care if you own both horses. You don't care who wins the race.
No, you don't. Let's go back to Katharine Gun now, the Iraq War whistleblower, where she talks a little bit about this whole idea of hybrid warfare. So the idea is you're not fighting, you're not successful on the battlefield. But using other means.
War has become, it's no longer conventional warfare. It's hybrid warfare, as they call it now. And so it's, in this kind of situation, nobody really knows who's doing what, right? I mean, that's the whole that's the result of hybrid war. And I think I keep referring to the Anglo-American, but basically it's the US, UK, former empires, and they're collapsing. I think it's fairly evident that, the British-American, 100-year rule is in the British sphere, it's gone on for longer, but it's coming to an end, and they can't fight a conventional war anymore. This is the problem. They're being on the battlefield. They are defeated by Russia's hypersonic missile capabilities at the top end of technology, but at the lower end of technology, they're beaten by the Ansar Allah, Yemeni low-tech version of conventional warfare, where the drones, fairly low-tech drones, are able to completely block, trade routes, and sink ships and so on. So the only real kind of warfare they have is this hybrid warfare that they're almost the experts at, I would say. I would argue that China and Russia they haven't developed the hybrid warfare to the extent that US, UK, and Israel have developed it. The sort of psychological warfare angle, the hybrid warfare side of things has been the key element of the US and UK deep state. All the CIA type activities and MI5 and MI6 activities, Mossad activities that have gone on for decades can be described as hybrid warfare. And, GCHQ is part and parcel of that, NSA obviously as well. And because they're paid by the state, they get their funding from the state, they have to constantly justify their existence. And without an external threat, their funding would drop, because if they don't constantly churn out reports claiming that, they've detected this and there's that going on, and without that threat level, they lose the funding levels.
So maybe it just comes down to that simple. These guys that don't want to lose their job because they've got to create. I'm reminded, Warren, of this book by John Stockwell, former colonel in the CIA.
Yes.
Back in the 1970s or 80s, he published this book, In Search of Enemies.
Yes. Yeah, and that's always going to be the way. I mean, you have to remember that the military-industrial complex and how much, when you look at America's economy, the military-industrial complex is a huge part of that. And every single senator has had a campaign donation from the military-industrial complex, whether it be Boeing, whether it be Lockheed Martin. Some people like Nikki Haley are absolutely swimming in it, and others have just had, a little bit. But what you have to remember is, for instance, if you were to send, we're locked in this yesterday's warfare for yesterday's men, if you like, because if you send an aircraft carrier into the Red Sea and you start firing off left, right, and centre, one Kinzhal or two Kinzhal's missiles into your flight deck, you're not flying any planes off anywhere. And trying to fight a war 8,000 miles from home with no air cover whatsoever, you can see what it does to Ukraine.
There's a sort of problem here, Martin, isn't there? The hybrid war is all very well, but can you win it? The answer is probably no.
Well, you can cause an awful lot of trouble in failing, though, can't you? That's the danger.
And terrorism.
I mean, in a sense, this is a sign of weakness, what we've seen in Moscow, rather than strength on the part of the West, and also the amateurish nature of the operation. I think if I was a Russian, I would be asking a question, could this have been prevented? Which was also the question that was asked about Manchester and so on.
Yeah.
Because it may be, I'm not saying this is the case, but it may be that the Russians were so all over this that they could have stopped it if they put their minds to it. And I think that's the sort of question, if I was a Russian MP, I would be asking the government about this. You know.
Absolutely.
And that's not unpatriotic. That's cutting to the nub of it.
They are all fair questions, though. But when you say that, as America, Great Britain and everybody else are behind these things, when you look at the terror attacks that actually happen on British soil and on American soil, these things are very, very incredibly difficult to stop if they're sensibly and well organised.
Well, especially if they're organised by the state itself, which is clearly the case in many of them. And therefore, it's easy to organise if you've got everything lined up.
Okay, so what's the bigger picture? My own view is that there's a massive world war being cooked up in the Middle East between China and the United States, and that my own view is that Russia is a sort of very irritating third force in all of this. Let's have you first, Warren.
For my part, here it is, because I've got as you know, I know aid workers in the Philippines and various areas as well, and also embassy staff out there, and this is being ramped up for a few years down the line. Russia and Israel is just the hors d'oeuvre. It's the starter for the main event. And anybody who thinks that's different, my intention is to be out there in the Philippines in the next couple of years to make sure we're there to report on it. I am that certain from what people are telling me that is the next massive hotspot. That's our World War III. It's not Russia. America are not going to go into Europe. They'll get Eastern NATO countries to go in if they can. Macron's talking absolute nonsense. He's talking through his backside. Maloney's even told him, shut the hell up.
Well, this is by saying he's going to send French troops into Ukraine.
Yes. Now, Russia are absolutely up for this. They're like, well, send them. Please send them, because the very first thing they'll do is target them and smash them. It is the same when we sent over. There are bonuses for knocking out Bradleys. There are bonuses for knocking out Challengers.
A lot of people ask these questions, Warren. What's in it for these people? Why? What's the point of a massive conflagration like this? And a third world war is almost unthinkable. World war, it would obviously be on another level.
Yeah, but they're not going to let it get to the stage where it goes nuclear. It's never going to be allowed to go nuclear. There will be a third world war over China, but it will never go nuclear. And here's the reason why. Absolutely everybody gets tons and tons of money from this. Think about this from a moral point of view. So you've got guys being paid by the military-industrial complex, okay, so they're getting campaign donations. They're also doing speaking events where they're getting 30,000 a speaker, and they're also buying shares in the company. So when children die, they're not just making money from the weapons, but they're also making more money by doubling down and buying shares in the companies that are killing these children in Gaza and Ukraine.
It sounds a little bit, I think Karl Marx might have something to say about this.
Yes, yeah.
Well, that's true.
Is this the end of capitalism? What is it?
Well, I mean, underlying all of this is the fact that the capitalist system has reached the end of its useful life. Underlying the collapse of the dot-com bubble was the fact that the new technologies, information technologies, are very hard to monetize for the capitalists. So there was a huge, the bubble went up, like railway shares in the 19th century, and then they got to the point where they suddenly realised, and I'll just briefly, an anecdote about this. My ex-wife Shelley used to work for Bloomsbury Publishers, and they used to just be, niche poetry market publishers, and then they got Harry Potter in, and they suddenly they were flush with cash, huge, and they didn't have a website. So she was put in charge of creating a website for them. Nigel Newton, who was the US boss of Bloomsbury, she had a budget of £3 million to build this website. It won Website of the Year award, and she went to the ceremony and all the rest of it. And then Nigel Newton flew over for this ceremony and said to my ex-wife, well, this is all very good, and I'm glad we've won the award, but I can't see a revenue stream here. We've spent £3 million on this.
Yes.
And she said, well, there isn't a revenue stream. if you want to stay in the game of publishing, you need a website. That's going to cost you £3 million, but you're not going to make any money out of it. And that's the problem with the dot-com bubble. And this is to do with technology of capitalism outraces the actual social organisation of it. So, for example, in China, they've got the most advanced robotics in the world.
Yep.
And they produced, some years ago now, an entirely robotised factory. And they're looking at it thinking, what the hell are we going to do with this?
Yes.
Because, if we're going to have robotised factories, what are the people going to do? And we're going to have to find some way to resolve this.
We were coming to that now, actually, because on Sunday in Amsterdam, you will be able to hear the dulcet tones of Kees van der Pijl. He's a professor of international relations that was at Sussex University and elsewhere. But I don't know if you want to stay with us a bit longer to listen to this as well, Warren.
Not a problem.
Okay, so let's do that. So he will be speaking at the Peace Rally in Amsterdam on Sunday, but he is the author of this book, States of Emergency, Keeping the Global Population in Check, and he's been keeping a very close eye on the Atlantic ruling class as a writer, an author, and campaigner and speaker ever since the early 1990s.
In the 1930s, in the United States, the capitalist class was forced to make serious concessions to the working class. And these concessions were not a revolution in themselves, but they did change the balance of forces to such an extent that you could speak of a real class compromise. There was a class compromise between the upper class, the middle classes, and the organized working class. After the war, that was brought to Western Europe through the Marshall Plan and under slightly different circumstances also to Japan and later to South Korea, but under even more repressive regimes. And the middle class always profited most from this class compromise. But at least the workers until the 1970s, when inflation got a free hand, owing to the U.S. decision to cut the dollar from gold so that you got an inflation of 10% per year simply in terms of the amount of dollars in circulation. But until the 1970s, workers' wages, again, for the organized working class, so trade union members, remained fairly constant. After that, they began to slip away due to inflation, and the fight of the workers mainly became to get some sort of inflation compensation. And one year after the next, they began to lose those fights. And industry began to move out, and so on and so forth. The middle class, on the other hand, retained an element of compromise because they were an asset owning class. They had their own house. Occasionally they had pensions. They had maybe some investments here and there beside their own house. And that remained in force until 1979. So in the 1980s, you got a different situation, in which the entire element of class compromise began to evaporate. And it was in that period, and especially after 1991, when the Soviet Union collapsed and the world's balance of forces completely capsized to the benefit of the capitalist side, and the workers and generally the populations of Western capitalist countries were losing. After 1991, a serious quest began, because as always, the ruling class is the first to understand the real situation, because they are with many. They have all these think tanks to organize thinking and collective decision making and consensus formation. They realized that something had to take the place of what used to be class compromises, in which initially for the workers and then for the middle class, there was also something that you could hope for. And after 1991, capital was no longer willing to accept any political direction. So something had to be discovered or developed to make sure that the large mass of the population would remain in line. And you have, for instance, Samuel Huntington's article on the Clash of Civilizations, which contradicted the original optimism of Francis Fukuyama, the end of history, no more world conflicts and this and that. And Huntington said it will always be conflict because we are living in civilizations that are perennially fighting each other. Liberalism in the West, Islam, Confucianism, as he very, very doubtful intellectually, but powerful in its appeal. And in 1998 there was an explicit conference dedicated to a new sort of politics that was needed, and that was presided over by Philip Zelikow, a key figure in the Bush Jr. administration. And he said what is necessary is a sort of event that for a generation will shape people's minds in terms of why what they have is already nice enough, to keep people in line, basically. And that 9/11 was in 9/11 that became reality. So Zelikow was actually the editor of the official 9/11 report, which is just a bag of lies and a whitewash. Of course, there was also the Project for a New American Century, which today should be read again, their reports, because they too said all the changes that they proposed to make sure that the United States gets back on top had come true, but they also included things like using enhanced viruses, laboratory enhanced viruses, to selectively wage biological warfare. So they said we should develop differential biological weapons which will affect one particular ethnic category of people, but not us. Or at least we should have vaccines against it. Well, that's the practical application of this politics of fear. So that eventually became the COVID. Why it was timed? Why the COVID crisis was timed in 1990 has many possible causes. In the book, I mentioned that at any price they wanted to prevent a re-election of Trump. And that worked, of course. They also had to deal with a possible new financial collapse of the type of 2008. But most of the elements of the COVID crisis were already being developed by various branches of government involved. Essentially the national security state, in combination with the IT giants, which are merely the internet arm, so to speak, of the national security state, and the media, who in the 1990s were subject to a massive concentration, which brought most of them into the hands of a handful of billionaire oligarchs who had these newspapers and media channels more or less as a plaything, because these days you don't make much money on a newspaper. So if a man like Jeff Bezos of Amazon has the Washington Post, it's not because he wants to get rich from it, because he's losing money on a daily basis for that newspaper. But when he opens the newspaper in the morning, he reads at least what he wants to read, and not rebel-rousing stuff.
So that's Kees van der Pijl there, author of the States of Emergency, Keeping the Global Population in Check. Terrific book. I've been reading it the last few weeks. And what he's saying there, he mentions Jeff Bezos at the end as the owner of the Washington Post. Well, who's the editor of the Washington Post? Does anyone know? Victoria Newland's husband. Is it Robert Kagan?
Kaplan.
Kagan. Robert Kagan. Yeah, so it's a small club.
Yep.
This is a small club, Warren, really.
It is, yeah. It's like the Institute for the Study of War is the Bible everybody goes to. That's run by Victoria Newland's sister-in-law. She's married to a Kagan. So it is, you've got them doing it from the outside and the inside as well. And this is, when he's talking about the oligarchs owning it, you and I, as journalists, have known people very, very simply who, when you are a journalist, you should, and the wonderful thing at the front line is I get, go and chase the stories you want to do, Warren. We won't duck anything. Here, with the journalism you have now, it is state-sponsored. If you don't do as one of these oligarchs tell you to do, there is a line given to you, and you will not deviate from
so,
that.
for example, with this Moscow terror attack,
Yes.
the bit of the breaking news, which has been fascinating, popping up on RT, is banned.
Yes, absolutely. Rumble is banned in France, obviously, because so far the owner of Rumble has obviously been pretty, shall we say, swimming against the tide. And it is very, very simple. As a journalist, if you don't do as you're told, if you work for one of these mainstream media companies, you'll very soon be out of a job.
Well, Case van der Pijl carries on now. The second clip from his longer interview, which will be up on our show page at thisweek.org.uk, God willing, later tonight, where he talks about some of what's going on in Gaza now, having a lot of its roots in the 9/11 attacks.
This is a classic, maybe the classic false flag event. In another book, Global Rivalries from the Cold War to Iraq, I already studied a number of national false flag events, like, for instance, the assassination of Italian politician Aldo Moro in 1978, the assassination of Olof Palme of Sweden in the mid-60s, I think 86, and a number of other incidents to learn about what is common to these events? Why can you arrive at a judgment that this is a conspiratorial, a deep state event? You know, where it's not a coincidence that these things happen. They are planned. To what extent are they planned? How can you? What are the commonalities involved? And 9/11 is actually the first worldwide, the first internationally relevant example of a false flag. You know, killing John F. Kennedy was also something that we were told was something else than what really happened, but it was confined to the national setting. 9/11 was the first event that had was international in its immediate effects. Now, how can you make the claim that Zionists, like, for instance, Paul Wolfowitz in the United States, under Secretary of Defense in the Bush administration, and before he had other functions as well, Richard Perle, who was also these people are dual nationals. They have an Israeli passport and they have a US passport. The idea of a major shock-like event that would allow Israel to stop having to fight its neighbors itself, but leave that to the United States, was prepared in a series of conferences. One in 1979 in Jerusalem, opened by the then new Prime Minister Menachem Begin, with the father of Benjamin Netanyahu, Ben-Zion Netanyahu, present, and of course the young Benjamin as well. And then in 1984 there was another conference presided over by Benjamin Netanyahu, and who was then Israeli ambassador at the UN. And participants included people like George Shultz and several other cabinet members of the Reagan administration. And the papers of that conference were published in a volume edited by Benjamin Netanyahu, and they were entitled "Terrorism: How the West Can Win." And in that book, which I have here and studied in detail, Netanyahu actually outlined that a politics of fear would be necessary, so something really big had to happen to unite the West into an anti-terrorist coalition, and they would go after those countries that harbored terrorists, and terrorists were those who fought for national liberation and any form of militant opposition. And for Israel, the most urgent thing was that after 1973, when they fought their fourth big war against their Arab neighbors, they still won, but it was a very narrow win. And it depended entirely on U.S. support, which after some hesitation was then made available by Nixon and Kissinger. After 1973, the Israelis began to think, and the Zionists in the United States thought along with them, they began to think of finding ways to have others pursue those wars. Now, I can't tell you the whole story, but the outcome of these plans for a war on terror, which is really explicit if you look at the reports of these conferences, and also at the book that I mentioned, which was edited by Netanyahu. It is very clear that they hoped that after a big event, so Netanyahu really says in his contribution to that volume, we shouldn't go after every hijacked plane, and then again a few years later another hijacked plane, and again go after it. We have to have one big event, and then a war on terror by coalition of the willing led by the United States. Now, the Project for a New American Century that I mentioned already also specifies in its reports that a new Pearl Harbor was necessary, and that again makes concrete the prediction of Zelikow, or the analysis of Zelikow, that he said in his 1998 conference. Politics is defined by major myth that lasts an entire generation. Now that's let's say the broad ideological setting. And of course the end of the Cold War led to some confusion, but that was then picked up again by the arguments like Samuel Huntington's Clash of Civilization and so on.
So that's a good old case of Van der Pale and his book States of Emergency. Maybe you can get your take, Warren, on this idea of this fascist takeover in the West and the elites, the oligarchs that are doing it. They want to make sure that the population don't fight back.
Yeah, absolutely. When you talk about this sort of takeover, and it is fascism one-on-one, when you have complete control of the people, when you have complete control of the media, when no opposition is allowed, what does that remind you of? When you have these false flag events like the Reichstag fire, what does that remind you of? It reminds you of exactly what was going on in 1930s Germany, which was a fascist state, and now we've got we don't have countries anymore. Corporations and the people who run them run governments. Say for instance, if you you look at Corbyn or anybody else, if you are not going to play ball with these people, they will destroy you. And you have to be part of the club. And if you're not part of the club, then you're on the outside. People like Bukele, and you see things that are happening in Haiti. They're on the outside of this, and they will not be allowed to win. And this club is written down. You've got the Club of Rome's writings that even say we must invent enemies for us to go after so that we can keep control of the people. They cannot be allowed.
Well, that's
to
right.
govern
It's a
themselves.
kind of a cult, isn't it?
Yes.
Really, yeah.
It's called the World Economic Forum.
Well, Martin, what's your take?
Well, if you think about it, fascism is the default mode of capitalism in crisis, isn't it? And it's actually quite subtle. You know, this is far more sophisticated than the manipulation of the 30s, because there's more things, more levers to pull. There is. You know. And of course, the other thing that they've definitely got into is this whole idea of using terror events to herd the population around. I mean, in the Soviet Union, you know, or East Germany, you didn't need to have false flag terror events by the government, because people had to do what the government said anyway. You know, the government didn't need to do anything like that. But what you've got now in the ostensible democracies is you've got to bamboozle them, and therefore, and this is, I mean, it's literally criminal. And of course, there is some possibility that police action could bring
the question
them to
is,
book.
will it work?
Well, it does work to a large extent. From their point of view, that's why they do it. But I'll just give you a little...
Aren't they just kidding themselves?
Well, they are kidding themselves, because ultimately it's building sandcastles on the beach and the tide's coming in, isn't it? In Colombia in 2012, the army were preparing to kill all 14 major trade union leaders in Colombia. Leaders of the 14 major trade unions. And they're going to do it all over a 2-week process. It's called Operation Dragon. But just as they were about to set off on this rampage, the National Police Force raided Army headquarters and arrested the Army leadership. And they're, you know, you're coming down to to answer a few questions. And I was peripherally involved in this, because I had to lobby my MP about it. Now, the thing that happened was that the police frustrated the attempt to kill the trade union leaders, but all these generals were then released and sent back to their jobs, and they weren't punished. And this is the kind of balance that we're fighting here. I think the idea of using police action to deal with what are essentially criminal events is not necessarily hopeless. And in the right circumstances, that can work.
Can we
because
just,
they literally are criminals.
Say something about Haiti? Do you both want to give your takes on what's been going on there? It's unbelievable, isn't it, over the last few weeks?
Yeah, absolutely. And Haiti is very much along the lines of, with the criminal gangs, which, of course, when you look at the brilliance of El Salvador and Bukele, who's there, he solved that. Now,
the way it's been portrayed here in the British press is, oh dear, the gangsters have taken over. What can we do?
Yeah, exactly that. Well, in El Salvador, they completely cleaned that up, because he turned around and said, I'm not listening to anything the West says.
Sorry, who did?
Bukele in El Salvador.
Right.
So what he did was he threw 70,000 gang members straight into jail, and suddenly it went from the murder capital of the world down to one of the safest places in the world. Haiti, we've got this so-called drug, we've got all these gangs and everything else, and America once again are sticking their oar in and going, we've got to get involved in this and this, that and the other. And of course this guy's already got a name as a barbecue and all the rest of it, the leader of the gangs and this, that and the other. But the guy is actually for the people rather than, than the terrorism that goes on there.
Some sort of puppet,
exactly.
US puppet.
Well, it's always been a US puppet ever since. I mean, you had Guatemala in 47.
So in Haiti, aren't they just swapping one US puppet for another, or not?
No, not if this guy gets in, you see, because they've had people trying to take over Haiti since 1951. And of course, eventually the people, because they're so poor, they've got nothing to lose, they turn to these people.
Almost sounds like another slave war.
It's exactly what it is.
Yeah.
It's exactly.
Martin, Haiti, your take.
Well, I mean, when Jean-Bertrand Aristide, the priest, became president of Haiti in the 90s, wasn't it?
Yeah.
The Lavalas movement, Avalanche movement, there was some kind of hope for Haiti.
Yeah.
But of course, what's actually happened since then, he was basically bumped out by the Americans.
He was.
And he fled to South Africa. And when the earthquake happened in Haiti, he flew back to Haiti to try and re-establish himself. And the US Marines had taken over the airport, and they wouldn't let him get off the plane. And of course, there are still questions, which are, this is the kind of show it is, so I'll bring this up. The Russian Navy immediately questioned what had happened with that earthquake.
Yeah.
That in actual fact, I mean, you know, people have conspiracy theories about geoengineering events or whatever, but the Russian Navy said, we suspect that this is what this is. Because, of course, there's a massive oil and gas field just off
it always comes down to money, Martin, doesn't it?
Yeah. Well, I mean, it's just money, but it's what's driving these people is it's not just money; it's power.
Yes.
Yeah. The money is a means of keeping the score.
Well, just as an aside,
I mean,
reading on antiwar.com, the Israelis are now threatening to cut off all of the banks in Gaza, because people are still managing to get aid money through to Gazans, and they're able then to buy food. So the Israelis are now saying we're going to switch this out of the global financial system, and they won't be able to use the bank cards anymore.
Yeah, I mean, money is the currency of power. It's very, very simple, because we do live in, obviously, as you're saying, this society where we're driven by money. But when you have control of all the resources, you have control of all the people. Because without resources, as we're seeing in Gaza, people can't survive.
No.
And before we wind up, do you want to say anything about Baltimore, this big container ship? Would you like to say anything?
Yes, I would, because first of all, you have to look at it, and then we have to look at who was involved in owning it, and the McConnell and everything else that's connected with it. But it is also a naval hub for the Americans. So whilst this is a problem, you have many ships and various other parts of the American Navy that can't actually get out of there. Not only that, you're talking about billions worth of dollars. And when you look at, when you look at it and you examine it completely, first of all, you have to go the infrastructure of the bridge, and obviously getting hit by something that big. But also look at where it loses control, and it's actually drifting away from the pylon, and it steers into it.
Yes, that's right. It does seem to make quite a sharp right-hand starboard turn directly into the pylon at full power, even though apparently it's lost power. When you say full power, you can see the black smoke coming out of the funnels. This happened literally just after the United States abstained at the UN Security Council over the calls for a ceasefire in Gaza. So is it feasible? The Israelis, Martin, hacked it? It's just ship? It's just to send a message to the Americans?
It's possible. It's possible it could be the Russians, couldn't it? If you think about it, there's all sorts of possibilities, aren't there?
They even floated the Ukraine one, wasn't there? Where it had a Ukraine captain. You don't want to give us $61 billion. I'll just steer it straight in your pile.
Well, that's right. I mean, and it may just be that, the infrastructure in the US is crumbling because they've wasted all their money on trying to invade Afghanistan and all the rest of it.
It certainly could be, yeah. So, anyway, before we say goodbye, our resident poet sent us a poem from Patrizia Opulenza. It's called In God's Name. In the name of God, they say, they do his work most every day. They kill, they lie, they bomb, they slaughter, starve and beat, keep short of water. Chase from their homes, shoot and kill, and empty Gaza, they say, it's God's will. The Stooges 3 seem quite possessed. God's will, it seems, gave each a test. Behind the scenes, Smotrich roams, as Ben-Gvir the limelight hones. Each one demonic as each other, as lives in Gaza all wish to smother. God's will be done, oh, oft hear them say. But who is this God to whom they pray? Who will be done in genocide? Starvation, slaughter, and children die. A tag team of 3 the world's seen vent on Palestine. No sentiment. Finance, security, and the leader, the devil's trio, an evil feeder. Malofsky, Bibi. Politically astute, keeps these 2 on side to boot. Ben-Gvir and Smotrich, the train of Bibi ride, all in God's name. Of misery, destruction, bombs, clear the grounds, till Gazans gone. Circling squares, often seen driven through lives and homes of people living extremist thoughts full of hatred, their God of mercy oft berated. Bibi keeps close his enemies, these 2 his stooges just can't see. Who's fooling who? Who's to know? Nuclear power, the world now knows, an idle threat of strength to show. In devil's lair these 3 together push slaughter now, just like the weather. A madness seems begot by all, each death not marked, no care at all. Blood is shed, vehement for war, on Palestine whose death all swore. God's will be done, now hear the cry, as faith and hope and love have died. Devils oft of evil say, in God's name we act this way. Thanks, Patricia, for this week's. We'll just say one thing. We may not be back until May, having a few problems with getting a good sound engineer, because Dave's off for a couple of weeks. And so it may be before we hear, but there will be something up on the stream. Maybe it's an interview from that week, that sort of thing. So
Anne is in West Sussex. Good morning to you, Anne.
Good morning to you both. We're talking earlier about all the restriction and what is going on with the traffic. Well, we haven't just arrived as an accident. This has been well planned to restrict all of our freedoms. Yeah. And I just want to urge people, and all of you, to just look up this woman, Alice Bailey, born in 1880, of the Lucas Trust. She is the one who has, with her organisation, that has founded a lot of the restrictions we have today. And one of the big ones is that we are her 10-point plan. And the reason why she is being heard is because there's a big department for her in the United Nations, and world leaders have been filmed in front of it. Take God and prayer out of the education system, reduce parental authority over the children, destroy the Judeo-Christian family structures, or the traditional Christian family structure. If sex is free, then make abortion legal and make it easy, make divorce easy and legal, free people from the concept of marriage for life, debase art, make it run mad, use media to promote and change mindsets, create an interfaith movement and get governments to make all these laws and to get the church to endorse these changes. There's a lot more, but as a mother and grandmother, I mean, look, we've had the stabbings in London, haven't we? And everybody's saying, how can this be happening? Our children are running wild in some parts of our country, and it starts in the big cities and it spreads out. We've got county lines. We've got so much that adults should be concerned about. And my work has always been in the community with families, because I believe what they say. If the children are running wild in your city or town, the adults in your cities and towns have failed. And we have failed. And we are actually mindset is being changed for all of us, accepting things that once our parents would never have dreamed of.
Time to sign off now. Thanks very much to our guest, Irish Republican Labour activist Martin Summers. Thanks also to Dr. Chris Hook, who joined us at the beginning of the show, and Warren Thornton. Warren, would you like to just give a plug for your social media, website, that sort of thing?
Yeah, thank you very much. If you go to the frontline.army, and you type that into your browser, that will bring up our web page. You can follow our daily show there. You can also see interviews with various wonderful people, including Andrew Bridgin, Scott Ritter and other people. And I would just like to say two things to your listeners. Please keep an eye out for this, because there are breaking stories that will be coming in the coming months. China and water. And that is just to let you know that the next basic, should we say, common thing that is going to be fought over is going to be water. And there are many things happening in the Middle East over that. So it's not all just oil and gas. And China is the big thing that's coming over the next
So the idea is that China is the next big boogeyman.
Yes, China will be the big war. This is just
Isn't
a warm-up.
it great the way these people just sell us boogeymen?
Yeah.
That's all they can do. That's how rubbish. I think someone needs to have a word with the king.
If people think Russia and Israel is Russia and Gaza is bad, wait for China.
Well, we shall see. Anyway, so thanks also to our sound engineer, Dave Bazanko. You can download our MP3s to listen in the car or anywhere you like. Follow Tony Gosling Censored on Telegram. Do please send me interviews and story tips via Not the BCFM Politics Show page. You'll find the podcast there, full-length interviews, story, links, comment page, and our email address is Martin and mine. Anyway, you can subscribe to my weekly newsletter, which might be a little bit late this week, and even donate this week, oneword.org.uk. We've been streaming live from PRSC Arts Centre in Bristol, on the talkradio.org.uk stream, at radioquk.com in Camberley, Surrey, and live on the Not the BCFM Politics Show app. If you can restream us live or rebroadcast this show, just let me know and I'll credit you here. Have a relaxing and enjoyable Easter weekend. Clocks forward on Saturday night, by the way. Do please join us for Not the BCFM Politics Show in May, but there should be something up on the stream as well, some interviews next Friday at 5 p.m. God bless, and don't let the satanic banksters get you down.
prison here is mine, so let it be known. For we have been through hell and high tide, I think I can rely on you. And yet you start to recoil, heavy words are so lightly thrown. But still I leap in front of a flying bullet for you. So what difference does it make? So what difference does it make? It makes none, but now you have gone, and you must be looking very old tonight. The devil will find work for idle hands to do. I stole and I lied, and why? Because you asked me to. But now you make me feel so ashamed, because I've only got 2 hands. But I'm still fond of you. So what difference does it make? Oh, what difference does it make? Oh, it makes none. But now you have gone, and your prejudice won't keep you warm tonight. Oh, the devil will find work for idle hands to do. I stole and then I lied just because you asked me to. But now you know the truth about me, you won't see me anymore. Well, I'm still fond of you. But no more apologies. No more apologies. And I'm feeling very sick and ill today, but I'm still fond of you.
love takes our train, summer breeze and brilliant light. Only love she feels, she controls all love. Love sails to a new life. Promised you a miracle, belief is a beauty thing. Promises, promises, as golden days break wandering. Only love she sees, he controls her love. Life goes a curve, everything is possible. Promises, everything is possible. I promised you a miracle. Belief is a beauty thing. Promises, promises, as golden days break wandering.
reflects on them a while. Love stood so quietly, slipping back on golden tides, breathing windscreen memories. Promised you a miracle, a belief is a beauty thing. Promises, promises, as golden days break wondering. Promises, as golden days